Welcome to SnoozyTor, the channel where history and storytelling blend into a gentle path towards sleep. Here we take great journeys through the lives of remarkable figures, not in the rush of textbooks or headlines, but in the quiet rhythm of bedtime stories. Tonight we begin the story of John D. Rockefeller. Born a poor farm boy in 1839, he would rise to become the world's first billionaire, and one of the most controversial men in American history. His life was filled with sharp contrasts, ruthless ambition on one hand and groundbreaking philanthropy on the other. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and follow along as we trace Rockefeller's extraordinary path, from the cold wooden floors of his childhood farmhouse to the towering legacy of wealth, power, and generosity that would outlive him. This is not just the story of a man, but the story of an era, told in the calm of the night, only here on SnoozyTor. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, the second of 6 children in a modest family. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling peddler and sometime con man, known for selling miracle cures and disappearing for months at a time. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was the opposite, deeply religious, frugal, and steady. From her, John absorbed the values that would shape his life: discipline, thrift, and the belief that wealth carried moral responsibility. The Rockefellers never had much money. They moved often, chasing opportunities that rarely lasted. John's father was unreliable, sometimes providing, often vanishing. This instability forced young John to grow up quickly. By the age of 8, he was already learning to handle household responsibilities. He cared for his younger siblings, worked odd chores, and helped his mother stretch every penny. Eliza instilled in him the Baptist faith, with its emphasis on hard work, honesty, and duty. Each Sunday, John attended church and listened carefully to sermons about stewardship and morality. Though his later business practices would draw criticism, Rockefeller never stopped seeing himself as a man carrying out God's will. To him, making money was not just a matter of ambition, it was proof of divine favor. At school, John was quiet, serious, and unusually good with numbers. He loved arithmetic and bookkeeping, fascinated by the way figures could bring order to chaos. His classmates called him reserved, even stiff, but he was known for dependability. Teachers saw in him a boy who was cautious beyond his years. At home, Rockefeller showed an instinct for business early. When he was 6, he found a wild turkey nest in the woods, raised the chicks, and sold them for a small profit. Later, he lent money to neighbors at modest interest, keeping precise records in a little notebook. These small ventures were the first signs of what would become a lifelong obsession with organization and profit. By the age of 16, John had taken his first job as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a produce shipping firm in Cleveland. He earned 50 cents a day, but more important than the wages was the discipline he learned. Each ledger had to be exact, each entry neat, each calculation flawless. He discovered a deep satisfaction in balancing accounts, in seeing order where others saw confusion. At night, he studied business manuals, teaching himself the principles of commerce, credit, and investment. He began to dream not just of earning a living, but of building something lasting. He once confided to a classmate, "I am bound to be rich." It was not arrogance so much as certainty, a quiet conviction rooted in his methodical character. Rockefeller's childhood was a blend of scarcity and ambition. He wore patched clothes and worked long hours, yet he carried himself with a sense of destiny. Even as a boy, he kept careful track of every penny he earned and spent, maintaining small ledgers that foreshadowed the meticulous records he would one day demand at Standard Oil. His father's unpredictable presence also left a mark. William Rockefeller, who called himself Big Bill, taught John a more ruthless lesson. In business, you must always bargain hard and never reveal weakness. Cheat the boys if you can, Big Bill was known to say, but never let them cheat you. While Eliza's influence stressed morality, Bill's influence stressed cunning. The combination produced a son who could be both devout and ruthless, a paradox that defined his life. By the time Rockefeller turned 20, he had saved enough from small jobs and loans to stake his first serious venture, a partnership in a grain and produce business. His reputation for honesty and reliability made him trustworthy in the eyes of lenders. He secured credit at a young age, something unusual for a man of his modest background. Looking back years later, Rockefeller would often tell the story of those first jobs and his sense of destiny. From the beginning, he said, "I was trained to work, to save, and to give." That triad, work, save, give, became the rhythm of his life. He believed that every dollar earned must be used with purpose, whether reinvested in business, saved for security, or given to charity. The boy who raised turkeys for profit, who lent out small sums of money, who dreamed of wealth while carefully counting pennies, this was the seed of the empire to come. He had no idea yet of oil, or of Standard Oil, or of philanthropy. But he carried inside him the habits that would make all of it possible. Discipline, thrift, faith, and an unshakable belief that he was destined for riches. In Richford and then Cleveland, neighbors saw only a serious, somewhat awkward young man. Few could imagine that this quiet bookkeeper would become the richest man in history. But Rockefeller himself never doubted. "I am bound to be rich," he had said. And in that conviction lay the beginning of his empire. By the late 1850s, John D. Rockefeller had moved with his family to Cleveland, Ohio, a city that was rapidly becoming an industrial hub. The Erie Canal and new railroads were bringing goods and people into the region, and ambitious young men saw opportunities everywhere. For Rockefeller, still in his teens, this was the environment that would nurture his first true steps into business. At 16, he had already begun his bookkeeping job at Hewitt & Tuttle. The pay was modest, 50 cents a day, but the lessons were invaluable. He learned how trade flowed across the Great Lakes, how commodities like grain and pork were priced and shipped, and how small miscalculations could lead to disaster. Each evening, he carefully noted his income and expenses in a little ledger, never letting even a penny go unrecorded. He often said later in life that this job was the best training I ever had. In 1859, at age 20, Rockefeller decided it was time to take a bigger leap. With $800 he had saved and $1,000 borrowed from his father, despite their strained relationship, he entered into a partnership with Maurice B. Clark, an English immigrant. They opened a commission business called Clark and Rockefeller, buying and selling grain, hay, meats, and other commodities. The startup was modest: 2 young men, a small office in Cleveland, and barely enough capital to cover initial shipments. But Rockefeller was relentless. From the start, he displayed the qualities that would later make him feared and admired. He negotiated ruthlessly with suppliers, always pressing for the lowest price. He cultivated bankers, presenting himself as reliable and steady, and soon secured credit lines that allowed the firm to expand beyond its small capital. While many young entrepreneurs of the time lived flamboyantly once they saw success, Rockefeller was austere. He dressed plainly, avoided drinking and smoking, and reinvested every dollar back into the business. The results came quickly. Clark and Rockefeller prospered, even during the uncertainty of the Civil War. By 1861, their firm was handling hundreds of thousands of dollars in business each year, shipping goods to Union armies and supplying a nation at war. Rockefeller, who had avoided military service by paying for a substitute as the law allowed, justified his choice by saying that he was serving his country better through business than he ever could with a rifle. His decision was criticized by some, but he never wavered in his conviction. During these years, Rockefeller's ambition became clearer. He began speaking of wealth not just as a goal but as a responsibility. He told friends and business partners, "I believe it is a man's duty to make all the money he can, honestly, and then give all he can." This blend of relentless pursuit and moral justification made him unique. He was not interested in wealth for display but for power and purpose. By the early 1860s, another opportunity was emerging that would change everything: oil. In 1859, Edwin Drake had successfully drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Almost overnight, the region erupted into chaos. Wildcatters drilling wells, speculators pouring money into oil leases, and barrels of crude sloshing through muddy streets. Cleveland, with its location on Lake Erie and access to railroads, quickly became a refining center for this new commodity. Rockefeller was watching carefully. He and Clark began investing modestly in oil refining, initially treating it as just another sideline to their grain business. But Rockefeller's instincts told him that this was no ordinary opportunity. Grain and pork were staples, but oil was a revolution waiting to happen. It could light homes, fuel factories, and transform cities. Unlike many who saw oil as a quick gamble, Rockefeller saw it as an industry to be mastered. His ambition crystallized during these years. He began telling colleagues that he would not be satisfied with mere comfort or modest success. He wanted stability, control, and permanence. "I would rather earn 1% on 100 men's efforts than 100% on my own," he once remarked, hinting at his future strategy of building vast organizations rather than relying on individual labor. By 1863, Rockefeller's small ventures had grown into something more substantial. He invested in a refinery built in partnership with Samuel Andrews, an inventive chemist who knew how to distill kerosene efficiently. This was Rockefeller's true entry into oil, and it marked the pivot from grain trader to industrialist. His ability to see the potential of refining rather than drilling would set him apart. Where others chased oil fields, Rockefeller focused on turning crude into usable products and controlling the entire process. Still in his early 20s, Rockefeller was already different from his peers. While other young businessmen of Cleveland spent their earnings on fine clothes, cigars, and social pleasures, Rockefeller walked home from the office each evening in the same modest suit, often carrying ledgers under his arm. He lived with discipline and restraint, traits that sometimes made him appear cold but allowed him to outlast competitors who were reckless with both money and risk. These early years formed the bedrock of his empire. The habits of meticulous bookkeeping, aggressive negotiation, cautious but bold investment, and relentless reinvestment would stay with him forever. The boy who once counted turkey eggs and lent pennies at interest was now building a firm that handled millions of dollars in trade. And yet, this was only the beginning. Rockefeller had planted his feet in Cleveland, secured his reputation as a reliable businessman, and entered the oil industry just as it was about to explode. His ambition had outgrown small partnerships and modest profits. He was ready to think in empires. It is 1863 and Cleveland is buzzing with talk of oil. Only 4 years have passed since Edwin Drake's well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, but the shockwaves of that discovery are spreading everywhere. Men with little more than a pickaxe and a dream are pouring into the oil fields, digging furiously, chasing fortunes they believe lie beneath the ground. Boomtowns spring up almost overnight, filled with muddy roads, wooden shacks, saloons, and speculators shouting about the next big strike. Most people see chaos. John D. Rockefeller sees opportunity. At 24, Rockefeller is already a seasoned businessman. He has survived the early years of partnership with Maurice Clark, weathered financial risks, and built a reputation for reliability among Cleveland's bankers. When Samuel Andrews, a talented young English chemist, approaches him with a new idea, Rockefeller listens carefully. Andrews explains that crude petroleum, when refined properly, can be turned into kerosene, a cleaner, brighter fuel than whale oil for lamps. Whale populations are dwindling and whale oil prices are soaring. The world is desperate for a cheaper, more reliable source of light. Oil could be that solution. Rockefeller studies Andrews' figures, the chemistry of refining, the costs of barrels and transport. He recognizes immediately that this isn't a gamble like drilling. Refining is controllable, stable, and scalable. He doesn't want to chase luck in muddy fields. He wants to master a process, improve it, and dominate the market. Together with Maurice Clark and Andrews, Rockefeller invests in a small refinery in Cleveland. It sits near the Cuyahoga River, perfectly located to receive crude oil shipped from Pennsylvania. The plant is modest, a few stills, barrels stacked outside, men in soot-stained clothes tending the fires, but Rockefeller's sharp eyes already imagine something much larger. From the start, Rockefeller imposes his strict discipline. He demands detailed records of every barrel of oil that arrives, every gallon refined, every shipment sent out. He scrutinizes costs mercilessly, insisting on savings wherever possible. Waste, he declares, is a sin, both financially and morally. When he sees leftover byproducts being dumped into the river, he refuses to accept it. "We will find a use for everything," he tells Andrews. The chemist begins experimenting, and soon they discover ways to turn byproducts like petroleum jelly, lubricants, and even paraffin wax into profitable products. This philosophy, waste nothing, maximize everything, becomes the cornerstone of Rockefeller's empire. While other refiners throw away half the crude they process, Rockefeller turns every drop into money. The business grows rapidly. Cleveland becomes one of America's leading oil refining centers, and Rockefeller is at the heart of it. But with growth comes conflict. Maurice Clark, his longtime partner, is cautious and nervous about expanding too quickly. Rockefeller, however, is certain oil is the future and bold investment is necessary. Their disagreements boil over in 1865. After one especially tense meeting, Clark throws up his hands and declares, "This business has grown too big for me. I want out." The price he names for his share is staggering. $72,500, equivalent to millions today. For Rockefeller, barely 26 years old, this is a terrifying sum. To buy Clark out, he will have to borrow heavily and risk everything he has built. Friends warn him not to take the gamble. Bankers hesitate to extend loans. Oil prices are volatile, sometimes plunging overnight when new wells are struck. But Rockefeller doesn't hesitate. He knows this is his moment. He borrows the money, scrapes together funds, and buys Clark out. Overnight, he becomes the sole head of the refinery. He renames it Rockefeller and Andrews, a company that will soon evolve into something far greater. Years later, Rockefeller would call this one of the most important decisions of his life. The risk was immense, but it gave him control, something he valued above all else. He now had the freedom to pursue his vision without compromise. And his vision was expansive. Rockefeller wasn't content with just being another refiner among many. He wanted stability in an industry that was wildly unstable. Oil prices swung violently, $10 a barrel one month, 50 cents the next. Refiners opened and closed overnight. Rockefeller believed the only way to survive was consolidation. Fewer, larger, more efficient companies that could withstand fluctuations. He began quietly buying out smaller competitors, folding them into his operations, offering stock in his company instead of cash when he could. By the late 1860s, Rockefeller's refinery was the largest in Cleveland, and he was already dreaming of a national presence. He built relationships with railroads, negotiating favorable shipping rates. He invested in storage facilities, barrel making, and warehouses, reducing his dependence on outside suppliers. Every link in the chain he wanted under his control. And yet, despite his growing power, Rockefeller's personal life remained modest. He still lived in a simple house, walked to church every Sunday, and taught Bible classes. He played the violin for relaxation, preferring music over the grand parties that other businessmen enjoyed. To those who knew him personally, he seemed almost monk-like, reserved, polite, disciplined. But beneath that calm exterior burned an ambition as fierce as fire. By 1867, Rockefeller was only 28 years old, yet he already controlled one of the largest refining operations in America. He was laying the foundations for what would become Standard Oil, the most powerful monopoly in U.S. history. The boy who once sold turkeys to neighbors had now taken his first great leap into an industry that would define the modern world. But the battles to come, the ruthless strategies, the secret deals, the war with competitors, were still ahead. For now, Rockefeller was sharpening his weapons, preparing to fight not just for survival but for domination. It is the year 1867, and Cleveland is a city transformed. Smoke pours from dozens of refinery chimneys, the smell of crude oil hangs heavy in the air, and the Cuyahoga River runs dark with oily residue. Men are getting rich or going bankrupt at dizzying speed. The oil boom is chaotic, unstable, and brutal. Most refiners are gamblers taking wild risks, hoping to strike it big before the market collapses. But John D. Rockefeller is not a gambler. He is a planner, a strategist, and he has a vision that sets him apart from the rest. By this point, Rockefeller and Andrews is the largest refinery in Cleveland. But Rockefeller is restless. He studies the numbers obsessively, tracking fluctuations in crude oil prices, shipping costs, and refining margins. He sees what others ignore. The industry is unsustainable. Hundreds of small refiners, competing with no coordination, flooding the market with product whenever crude prices dip. The result is constant volatility, sometimes fortunes, sometimes ruin. Rockefeller believes there is only one solution: consolidation. Instead of dozens of small, inefficient refineries competing, there should be a single disciplined company large enough to stabilize the entire industry. Prices would be predictable. Supplies would be reliable. Waste would be eliminated. He envisions not just a business but an orderly system. And at the center of that system, of course, would be himself. Enter Henry Flagler. In 1867, Rockefeller meets Flagler, a sharp, ambitious businessman 10 years his senior. Where Rockefeller is quiet and reserved, Flagler is outgoing, persuasive, with a natural flair for negotiation. But beneath the charm lies a ruthless streak as cold as Rockefeller's own. The two men are instantly drawn to each other, not as friends but as allies who recognize the same hunger in each other's eyes. It is Flagler who helps articulate Rockefeller's dream. This industry cannot survive as it is, Flagler tells him. The small refiners will destroy each other. We must bring order, by force if necessary. Rockefeller nods. One company. One standard. Standard Oil. The name itself is strategic. While competitors advertised based on price or location, Rockefeller wanted his company to symbolize reliability. Customers buying Standard Oil kerosene would know it was safe, clean, and consistent. No exploding lamps. No cheap impurities. In an industry filled with fly-by-night operators, Standard would be a promise. To achieve this, Rockefeller and Flagler develop a bold strategy. First, they target shipping costs, the lifeblood of the industry. Railroads are desperate for steady business, and oil is one of their most valuable cargoes. Rockefeller and Flagler approached the railroads with a daring proposal. In exchange for guaranteed high volumes of oil shipments, Standard Oil will demand secret rebates, refunds on a portion of the official shipping price. Competitors will still pay the full rate, but Standard will quietly pay far less. This arrangement, known as the railroad rebate system, tilts the playing field dramatically. Competitors cannot understand how Standard can sell kerosene at such low prices and still profit. They do not know that for every barrel shipped, Rockefeller is paying only a fraction of what they pay. But Standard's strategy doesn't stop there. Rockefeller uses his efficiency to crush rivals. When he sees a competitor struggling, he offers to buy them out, not for cash but in Standard Oil stock. Many accept, preferring to join the winning team rather than face ruin. Those who refuse are met with relentless price wars. Standard drops kerosene prices so low that competitors cannot survive, then quietly raises them again once the competition is gone. In Cleveland, the strategy works with devastating speed. One by one, refiners fall. In just a few years, Rockefeller buys out or bankrupts 22 of the city's 26 oil refineries. It becomes known as the Cleveland Massacre, though there is little blood, just business deals signed under immense pressure. When the dust settles, Standard Oil controls nearly all refining capacity in Cleveland. At only 30 years old, Rockefeller has achieved something unprecedented. He has transformed a chaotic regional industry into an empire in the making. Standard Oil is no longer just a company, it is becoming a machine, efficient, relentless, and unstoppable. Yet in his personal life, Rockefeller remains almost shockingly modest. He still dresses plainly, avoids luxury, and donates regularly to his church. While other magnates flaunt their wealth with mansions and lavish parties, Rockefeller keeps a simple home in Cleveland and spends evenings playing the violin for his children. To outsiders, he seems an odd contradiction. A ruthless monopolist in the boardroom, a humble, devout Baptist at home. Still, even his personal habits reflect his business philosophy. He eats frugally, saves meticulously, and insists that every penny be put to productive use. A penny saved is a penny earned, his mother taught him, and he carries that lesson into the heart of Standard Oil. By the late 1860s, Rockefeller's power is undeniable. His competitors fear him, the railroads respect him, and Cleveland bankers trust him implicitly. But this is only the beginning. The real battles lie ahead. Against rival refiners in Pittsburgh and New York, against the railroads themselves, against journalists, politicians, and eventually the U.S. government. For now, though, the foundations are set. With Henry Flagler at his side, Samuel Andrews in the refinery, and a growing army of loyal employees, Rockefeller prepares to take Standard Oil beyond Cleveland. The oil industry is still young, volatile, and fragile. But in Rockefeller's mind, its future is already written. Order out of chaos, profit out of waste, control out of competition. Standard Oil is born, and it will stop at nothing to dominate. It's early 1868, and the lamplit office of Standard Oil smells faintly of kerosene and tobacco smoke. John D. Rockefeller sits at his desk, studying a large map of the eastern United States. Tiny pins mark oil refineries, railroad lines, and shipping depots. To him, it doesn't look like geography. It looks like a battlefield. The oil industry is exploding. In Pennsylvania, new wells gush crude faster than barrels can be built to hold it. In Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and New York, refineries are multiplying by the dozen, each trying to seize a piece of the booming kerosene trade. To the average refiner, it feels like opportunity. To Rockefeller, it feels like chaos, and chaos is weakness. Enter Henry Flagler, his indispensable lieutenant. Flagler has a mind for strategy as sharp as a razor. Where Rockefeller obsesses over numbers, Flagler thrives on negotiation and leverage. He knows that if Standard Oil wants to expand, it must secure an advantage so overwhelming that competitors cannot hope to match it. Their target, the railroads. In the late 1860s, crude oil could only be transported efficiently by train. 3 major railroads dominated the Pennsylvania to New York routes: the New York Central, the Erie, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. Every barrel of oil, every gallon of kerosene, passed through their hands. Whoever secured the best shipping deal could dominate the market. One evening, in a private dining room of Cleveland's American Hotel, Rockefeller and Flagler sit across the table from executives of the New York Central Railroad. The air is heavy with cigar smoke. Crystal glasses glimmer under the gaslight. The conversation is polite but charged with tension. "Gentlemen," Rockefeller says softly, his voice calm but firm, "Standard Oil can guarantee you shipments of 60 carloads per day. Every day. Without fail." The railroad men exchange surprised glances. Such steady volume is unheard of. Most refiners can barely promise a fraction of that, and their shipments fluctuate wildly. In exchange, Flagler adds smoothly, "We require special consideration." He leans forward, lowering his voice. "A rebate. 25, perhaps 30%. The executives hesitate. Offering discounts is one thing, but to give such deep, secret rebates risks alienating every other shipper. Rockefeller meets their eyes, steady and unblinking. "What we offer is stability. You will not find it elsewhere. The oil industry is volatile. Refineries open and close like mayflies. But we endure. We will endure. Partner with us and your lines will run full." The railroad men whisper among themselves, the clink of ice in their glasses punctuating the silence. At last they nod. The deal is struck. But Rockefeller doesn't stop at 30%. Over the coming months, Standard Oil negotiates even deeper rebates, sometimes as much as 50 to 75% off the official shipping price. Even more devastating, they secure drawbacks. For every barrel a competitor ships on the same line, the railroad secretly refunds a portion of that fee to Standard Oil. In other words, Standard profits from its rivals' shipments. It is a strategy as brilliant as it is ruthless. While competitors pay the full official rate, Standard pays only a fraction. Competitors cannot understand why Standard's kerosene sells so cheaply yet still yields profit. They suspect fraud, but they cannot prove it. The secret rebates remain hidden in private contracts, guarded fiercely by both Standard and the railroads. With shipping costs slashed, Rockefeller begins to undercut his competitors. His kerosene floods the market at prices others cannot match. Refiners across Cleveland and beyond find themselves squeezed. They cannot compete. Some sell to Standard, others collapse into bankruptcy. The tactic spreads. Soon Standard Oil secures similar deals with the Erie and the Pennsylvania railroads. The effect is catastrophic for rivals. It is as if Rockefeller has built invisible walls around the oil trade. Every shipment that moves strengthens Standard's position, while competitors bleed money. But the deals are not without risk. Word begins to leak about these secret rebates. Competitors whisper angrily in taverns and hotel lobbies. Newspapers hint at shady arrangements between Standard Oil and the railroads. Even some politicians begin to take notice. The arrangement may be profitable, but it is fragile, dependent on secrecy. If exposed, it could spark outrage. Rockefeller, however, remains unshaken. "Let them whisper," he tells Flagler. "By the time they learn the truth, it will be too late." And he is right. Within just a few years, Standard Oil grows from one of many refiners into a near-dominant force. By 1870, Rockefeller formally incorporates Standard Oil of Ohio. He issues shares, professionalizes the company, and sets his sights beyond Cleveland. The incorporation is more than a legal maneuver, it is a declaration of war. With Standard Oil of Ohio, Rockefeller has created a weapon powerful enough to pursue his dream of total industry consolidation. No longer a loose partnership, Standard is now a corporate machine, with Rockefeller at its head and Flagler as his general. From this point forward, every decision, every deal, every battle will be guided by a single vision: to bring the oil industry under Standard Oil's control. At home, Rockefeller remains the picture of modesty. He still walks to church on Sundays, still donates 10% of his income to charity, still lives in a simple Cleveland house. To his neighbors he is polite, soft-spoken, even kind. But behind closed doors, the quiet man with the sharp eyes is orchestrating one of the most aggressive corporate takeovers in history. By 1870, Standard Oil controls 10% of the nation's refining capacity. Within a few years, that share will leap to 25%, then 50%, then higher still. Rivals curse Rockefeller's name, calling him a vampire, schemer, an octopus strangling the industry. But they cannot stop him. The railroad rebates have given him the most precious advantage in business: leverage. And Rockefeller knows how to use it. The stage is set. The Cleveland Massacre, the consolidation of an entire city's oil industry, is just around the corner. And Rockefeller, calm as ever, is already plotting his next move. The year is 1872. The winter air in Cleveland is sharp, the streets crusted with snow and ice. Inside a modest but busy office on Euclid Avenue, John D. Rockefeller studies his ledgers with silent intensity. Around him, clerks scurry with papers, telegraphs click with incoming news, and the smell of kerosene lingers faintly in the air. Outside, however, panic is spreading through the oil industry. Rumors of a shadowy organization called the South Improvement Company are flying. Word has leaked that Rockefeller, together with the railroads, has struck an arrangement that could destroy every independent refiner in Cleveland. The rumors are not entirely wrong. The South Improvement Company was a proposed alliance between major railroads and select refiners, with Standard Oil at its center. Under this scheme, the railroads would raise official shipping rates for everyone else while secretly giving Standard massive rebates. Even more devastating, Standard would receive drawbacks, payments for every competitor's shipment. Imagine Burger King paying McDonald's every time it sold a Whopper. That was the logic of the SIC. When the news breaks, outrage erupts. Independent refiners storm through the streets of Pennsylvania oil towns, shouting slogans, burning effigies, boycotting any refinery rumored to be linked to the scheme. Angry crowds march with banners reading, "Down with Monopoly! Down with Standard Oil!" The public backlash is so fierce that within 2 months the South Improvement Company collapses. But Rockefeller has already seized his advantage. Though the SIC officially dies, the mere fear of it has weakened Cleveland's refiners. Believing they cannot possibly compete against Standard's secret railroad deals, many are already desperate to sell. Rockefeller seizes the moment. One by one he begins visiting competitors in their offices. Always polite, always calm, hat in hand. But beneath the courtesy lies an ultimatum. "Gentlemen," he tells them, "this industry cannot survive with so many small operators. Prices will keep falling, profits will vanish, and sooner or later you will be ruined. But I can offer you stability. I can offer you shares in Standard Oil. If you join us, you will prosper. If you refuse," he lets the words hang in the air. The implication is clear. The offers he makes are not generous. A refinery worth $150,000 might be valued at only $45,000 in Standard stock. But faced with the choice of slow ruin or immediate survival, many refiners take the deal. Those who hesitate watch Standard/kerosene prices to levels they cannot match. Their customers vanish. Their creditors grow nervous. Within weeks, they are forced back to the negotiating table. It becomes known as the Cleveland Massacre. In just 6 weeks, Rockefeller buys out 22 of the city's 26 refineries. Competitors vanish almost overnight. Some owners retire bitter and resentful. Others accept Standard stock and become wealthy as the company grows. A few swallow their pride and stay on as managers, now working for the very man who conquered them. For Rockefeller, it is a triumph. Cleveland, once a chaotic battlefield of dozens of rival refiners, is now firmly under his control. By mid-1872, Standard Oil commands 85% of Cleveland's refining capacity. Yet the public reaction is fierce. Newspapers denounce Rockefeller as a predator, a monopolist, a man strangling honest competition. Editorial cartoons portray Standard Oil as a monstrous octopus, its tentacles wrapping around railroads, refineries, and politicians. The words "robber baron" begin to circulate in American vocabulary. Rockefeller, however, is unmoved. "The day of combination is here to stay," he later tells an associate. Individualism has gone, never to return. In his mind, he is not destroying competition. he is saving the industry from chaos. By eliminating the weak and inefficient, he is building order, stability, and reliability. The industry, he believes, needs a single guiding hand. And that hand is his. Behind closed doors, he works tirelessly to integrate his new acquisitions. Redundant refineries are shut down. The best equipment is transferred to Standard's primary plants. Skilled workers from failed companies are offered jobs under the Standard banner. Slowly, the chaos of Cleveland becomes a streamlined machine. At home, Rockefeller's life remains strangely ordinary. He still dresses modestly, keeps meticulous household budgets, and teaches Sunday school at his Baptist church. While newspapers portray him as a sinister monopolist, his neighbors see a quiet family man who plays the violin in the evenings. It is this contrast, ruthless in business, devout in private, that makes him such a puzzling figure. But there is little doubt, the Cleveland massacre changes everything. It is the first great consolidation of the oil industry. It proves Rockefeller's strategy works, not just in theory but in practice. And it gives him a taste of the power that comes with monopoly. By the time the smoke clears, Standard Oil is no longer just a successful refinery. It is the dominant force in Cleveland. And Rockefeller, at only 33 years old, is already plotting his next conquest: Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York. The Cleveland massacre is not the end. It is only the beginning of a campaign that will spread across the entire nation. The year is 1873. Across the United States, the unthinkable is happening. Banks are collapsing, businesses are failing, and entire industries are grinding to a halt. The New York Stock Exchange has closed its doors for 10 straight days, the longest suspension in American history. It is the beginning of what will later be called the Panic of 1873, a financial disaster that plunges the country into a 6-year depression. For many businessmen, it is a nightmare. For John D. Rockefeller, it is an opportunity. By now, Standard Oil dominates Cleveland. With 85% of the city's refineries under his control, Rockefeller has proven himself a master of consolidation. But beyond Cleveland, the oil industry remains volatile. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York still teem with independent refiners fighting for survival. The Depression exposes their fragility. Credit dries up. Refiners who once borrowed freely from banks can no longer pay their debts. Crude oil prices plummet and kerosene profits vanish. While others panic, Rockefeller remains calm. His financial conservatism, his obsession with avoiding debt, his habit of reinvesting profits instead of borrowing recklessly, suddenly looks prophetic. Where competitors drown in loans they cannot repay, Standard Oil remains steady. Its balance sheets are clean, its reserves deep, its contracts with railroads unbroken. In his Cleveland office, Rockefeller meets with Henry Flagler and Samuel Andrews. The men study reports of refineries for sale at bargain prices. "Gentlemen," Rockefeller says quietly, tapping his ledger, "this is the moment we've been waiting for. While others are drowning, we will build." The Depression becomes his weapon. One by one, struggling refineries approach Standard Oil, desperate for rescue. Rockefeller offers them the same choice he gave in Cleveland: sell out, take Standard stock, and join the winning team, or fight and risk annihilation. Faced with bankruptcy, most surrender. By 1875, Standard Oil controls refineries not just in Cleveland, but in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York. His empire stretches across state lines. To finance this expansion, Rockefeller creates a new structure: the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, incorporated in 1870 but now functioning as the central hub for a network of affiliates. Standard issues shares to investors, but control remains tightly in Rockefeller's hands. He and his inner circle own the majority of stock, ensuring decisions remain unified and disciplined. But Rockefeller's genius is not just in buying refineries, it is in making them efficient. During the Depression, he orders every part of Standard's operations to be examined for waste. Barrels are redesigned to use less iron. Byproducts once discarded are refined into lubricants, paraffin wax, and even Vaseline. Nothing is wasted. Workers are trained to save even the smallest materials: glue from barrels, scraps of tin, ashes from the furnaces. Cut the waste, Rockefeller insists, and save a fortune. This relentless efficiency allows Standard to keep kerosene prices low, undercutting competitors while still turning a profit. Families across America, struggling through the Depression, rely on kerosene lamps to light their homes. Standard Oil becomes their lifeline. The cheaper kerosene gets, the more they depend on it. But not everyone celebrates Rockefeller's rise. In oil regions of Pennsylvania, independent refiners curse his name. They accuse him of exploiting the Depression to destroy honest businesses. Editorials call him a vulture, feeding on the carcass of ruined men. Yet even his critics admit, Standard's kerosene is cheap, clean, and reliable. Customers may hate Rockefeller, but they buy his product anyway. Meanwhile, Rockefeller's personal life contrasts sharply with the storm raging in the economy. At home, he is calm, almost serene. He rises early, eats a modest breakfast, prays with his family, then spends his mornings reviewing reports. In the afternoons, he takes long walks or plays with his children. To his neighbors, he appears almost detached from the economic panic tearing the country apart. In truth, his discipline shields him from fear. Worry, he often tells his associates, is a waste of energy. By the end of the 1870s, Standard Oil has weathered the Depression not only intact, but stronger than ever. It now refines more than 90% of the oil in Cleveland, 70% in Pittsburgh, and nearly half of all oil in the United States. Rockefeller's strategy is working. Still, the public is beginning to take notice. Rumors of secret railroad rebates and ruthless buyouts spread. Journalists whisper of corruption. Politicians murmur about monopoly. The word trust begins to creep into public discourse, carrying an ominous tone. Rockefeller, however, remains unbothered. In his mind, he is building not a monopoly but an orderly industry. One company, one standard, one vision. To him, it is progress. To his enemies, it is tyranny. The panic of 1873 destroys thousands of businesses. But for Standard Oil, it is the forge in which Rockefeller's empire is hardened. From the wreckage of a depression, he emerges stronger than ever. And as the nation slowly recovers, Rockefeller sets his sights even higher. The railroads have been his allies, but soon he will find himself in conflict with them. The battle for control of America's oil industry is far from over. The year is 1877. Across the United States, the economy is slowly recovering from the Depression. Railroads expand westward, cities grow taller, and kerosene lamps continue to glow in nearly every American household. In Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and New York, one name now dominates conversations about oil: Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller has already consolidated Cleveland, swallowed Pittsburgh's smaller refiners, and gained footholds in Philadelphia and New York. Yet his ambition does not stop there. He envisions something no businessman has dared to attempt: a single national monopoly over the oil industry. In his Cleveland headquarters, Rockefeller outlines the vision to Henry Flagler and his inner circle. Gentlemen, we are not simply running refineries. We are creating order. The oil industry must be one. It must have discipline. No more wild fluctuations, no more reckless competition. Standard Oil will be that discipline. But conquering the entire industry requires more than buying out competitors. It requires a new organizational structure. Standard Oil, once just a Cleveland company, begins forming a web of subsidiaries across the nation. Each operates under local management but reports back to Rockefeller. Together, they form what is called the Standard Oil Trust, a new corporate model that will soon become infamous. The trust allows Rockefeller to centralize control. Stockholders in dozens of different companies hand over their shares in exchange for trust certificates, which guarantee them profits. In return, Rockefeller and a handful of trustees control the entire network. It is, in effect, a shadow empire, one that owns refineries, pipelines, rail contracts, barrel factories, and shipping terminals from Pennsylvania to New Jersey to Ohio. The numbers are staggering. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil controls nearly 80% of American refining capacity. Competitors who once fought fiercely for survival are gone, absorbed into the Standard machine. The few that remain operate on Rockefeller's terms, their profits dictated by his decisions. How did he achieve such dominance? The answer lies in strategy as much as money. First, Rockefeller builds vertical integration. Instead of buying crude oil from middlemen, Standard purchases its own wells. Instead of relying on independent barrel makers, Standard manufactures its own. Even the chemicals used in refining are produced in Standard's facilities. By owning every stage of the process, production, refining, shipping, and retail, Standard eliminates middlemen and cuts costs ruthlessly. Second, Rockefeller invests in pipelines, a revolutionary alternative to railroads. The railroads, once his allies, now grow wary of Standard's power. They begin raising rates, hoping to squeeze profits from Rockefeller's empire. Rockefeller responds by backing pipeline construction. Long steel tubes snake across Pennsylvania hills, carrying crude directly from wells to refineries without a single train car. The railroads protest, but the genie is out of the bottle. Pipelines become the arteries of Standard Oil, weakening the railroad's grip on transportation. Third, Rockefeller perfects the use of price wars. When a competitor refuses to sell, Standard slashes kerosene prices in that region to levels no one else can match. Competitors bleed money while Standard, with its immense scale, absorbs the losses. Once the rival collapses, Standard quietly raises prices again. Never too high, just enough to sustain dominance. The tactic earns Rockefeller a reputation as ruthless, but it works. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil is everywhere. In New York, its refineries dominate the waterfront. In Pennsylvania, its pipelines stretch across entire counties. In Chicago, it controls distribution warehouses. From Maine to Mississippi, the blue and white Standard Oil barrels are as familiar as bread or flour. Yet success comes at a cost. Public opinion begins to turn sharply against Rockefeller. Farmers accuse him of exploiting pipelines to strangle independent producers. Small refiners call him a tyrant. Editorials denounce Standard as the most merciless monopoly ever devised. Cartoons in Harper's Weekly show Standard Oil as a giant octopus, its tentacles wrapping around railroads, state legislatures, and even the U.S. Capitol. For Rockefeller, the criticism is irrelevant. He rarely grants interviews, avoids public appearances, and refuses to defend himself in newspapers. To his mind, public opinion is fickle, results are eternal. The day of combination is here to stay, he tells an associate. We are merely the instruments of economic evolution. Privately, however, the scrutiny begins to weigh on him. He suffers from chronic digestive problems, stress-induced insomnia, and a condition called alopecia, which causes his hair to fall out. By his mid-40s, Rockefeller is bald, his mustache gone, his eyebrows thin. To outsiders, his appearance reinforces the image of a cold, calculating monopolist. Yet those who know him personally describe a soft-spoken man who plays the violin, reads the Bible daily, and gives dimes to children on the street. In the midst of this storm, Rockefeller's empire only grows larger. By 1882, Standard Oil refines 90% of all oil in the United States. Its dominance is total. Competitors exist only at Rockefeller's mercy. The trust has become the model for future monopolies in steel, railroads, and sugar. But total control invites total opposition. State governments begin investigating. The press grows louder in its condemnation. And soon the federal government itself will enter the battle. For now, though, Rockefeller is untouchable. He has done what no one before him dared to dream. He has built a national monopoly, a corporate empire so vast and efficient that it seems unstoppable. The poor farm boy from Richford, New York, has become the master of American industry. And the world is only just beginning to reckon with his power. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil is no longer just a company. It is an empire. Its blue and white barrels line every port, its pipelines crisscross Pennsylvania, and its refineries tower over Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and New York. For John D. Rockefeller, the dream of an orderly oil industry has become reality. He controls nearly 90% of America's oil refining. But power of this magnitude cannot remain uncontested. Across the nation, resentment boils. Independent producers accuse Rockefeller of crushing competition. Farmers protest that Standard's pipelines leave them no choice but to sell crude at unfair prices. Small-town businessmen whisper about secret rebates and shadowy deals with railroads. To them, Rockefeller is not a visionary. He is a tyrant. The press begins to sharpen its knives. Editorials denounce Standard Oil as a monopoly strangling the lifeblood of American enterprise. Political cartoonists depict Rockefeller as a giant spider, ensnaring railroads and Congress in his web, or as an octopus whose tentacles reach into state legislatures, banks, and even the White House. Ordinary Americans, struggling under falling wages and rising inequality, start to see in Rockefeller the face of unchecked corporate greed. At first, Rockefeller ignores it. He has always believed that public opinion is fleeting, while results endure. "I have worked not for publicity but for results," he once told an associate. He avoids interviews, declines public speeches, and maintains his life of quiet devotion. Church on Sundays, family dinners, violin in the evenings. To him, the criticism is noise. But then comes a new kind of journalist, one who will not be ignored. Her name is Ida Minerva Tarbell, and she will become Rockefeller's most formidable opponent. Tarbell is no ordinary writer. She is the daughter of a small oil producer in Pennsylvania, a man who lost everything when Standard Oil's pipelines and pricing schemes drove independent refiners out of business. She grew up watching her father struggle, her family's livelihood crushed by the shadow of Rockefeller's empire. That childhood memory fuels her mission. By the 1890s, Tarbell is a respected journalist for McClure's magazine. Unlike sensationalist reporters, she is meticulous, methodical, much like Rockefeller himself. She spends years investigating Standard Oil, combing through court records, interviewing former employees, collecting letters and contracts. She speaks to ruined refiners, disgruntled railroad men, and anyone who has crossed paths with Rockefeller. Slowly, piece by piece, she assembles a portrait of how Standard became so powerful. Her series, The History of the Standard Oil Company, begins publication in 1902. It is unlike anything the public has seen. Tarbell writes not with rage but with precision. She lays out the secret rebates, the price wars, the intimidation tactics. She describes the Cleveland massacre in stark detail. She explains how Rockefeller used the railroads as weapons, pipelines as chokeholds, and stock acquisitions as silent assassins of competition. Her words hit like dynamite. Across the country, readers devour the series. Politicians wave copies in Congress, demanding investigations. Small-town Americans who had long suspected foul play but lacked proof, now see Rockefeller's empire laid bare. Tarbell's writing transforms Rockefeller's reputation. To his supporters, he is a visionary. To the public, thanks to Tarbell, he is the arch-monopolist, the embodiment of everything corrupt about corporate power. For Rockefeller, the series is a personal blow. He despises publicity, and now his name fills headlines. Worse, Tarbell portrays him not as a genius, but as a cold manipulator, an octopus strangling freedom itself. Friends advise him to respond, to issue public statements defending Standard's record of efficiency and innovation. Rockefeller refuses. Silence, he believes, is strength. Yet inwardly, the criticism gnaws at him. By this time, Rockefeller is already suffering from health issues. Stress has ravaged his body. He has alopecia, which has left him bald, his eyebrows thin, his mustache gone. His skin is pale, his frame lean, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. To the public, these images, circulated in newspapers alongside Tarbell's series, seem to confirm her narrative. Rockefeller looks not like a benevolent businessman, but like a villain from a Gothic novel. Meanwhile, the political tide is turning. The progressive era is dawning, and with it comes a wave of reformers determined to break the grip of monopolies. Tarbell's work provides ammunition for these crusaders. Senators, governors, and even presidents begin calling Standard Oil a threat to democracy. Still, Rockefeller does not yield. He has weathered financial panics, lawsuits, and endless criticism before. His faith remains unshaken. Each morning he reads his Bible, prays with his family, and reminds himself that his wealth is a gift from God, to be used for good. He continues expanding Standard's reach globally, into Europe, into Asia, into Latin America. While America debates his methods, Rockefeller thinks in centuries. Yet for all his confidence, one fact becomes clear. The empire he built has grown so vast that it can no longer hide in the shadows. Tarbell has dragged it into the light. The people are watching. And soon the government will act. As Rockefeller reviews reports in his office, the whispers of reform grow louder. The Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890, now hangs over Standard Oil like a storm cloud. Courts and politicians are circling. The question is no longer whether Rockefeller's empire will face a reckoning, it is when. And as he folds Tarbell's latest article and sets it aside with an expressionless face, Rockefeller knows that the battle ahead will be unlike any he has fought before. By the turn of the 20th century, Standard Oil is more than a business empire, it is a nation within a nation. It refines over 90% of America's oil, owns pipelines, rail contracts, shipping terminals, barrel factories, and even controls distribution to small-town general stores. From kerosene lamps in farmhouses to lubricants in factories, Standard Oil touches nearly every corner of American life. But its very success has made it the target of mounting political fury. The voices of journalists like Ida Tarbell have turned public opinion against Rockefeller, painting him as the ultimate monopolist. Farmers demand action, small refiners cry for justice, and reformers in Washington see in Standard Oil the perfect test case for a new weapon, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Passed more than a decade earlier, the Sherman Act was designed to stop combinations and restraint of trade. 4 years it sat largely unused, its language vague and its enforcement weak. But under President Theodore Roosevelt, nicknamed the Trust Buster, the government begins wielding the law with new force. Roosevelt believes monopolies threaten democracy itself, and Standard Oil is the largest and most notorious of them all. In 1906, the United States government formally files suit against Standard Oil, accusing it of illegal restraint of trade and monopolistic practices. The case is monumental, United States versus Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. The trial drags on for years. Courtrooms are filled with mountains of documents, contracts, shipping records, rebate agreements. Witnesses testify about secret deals, predatory pricing, and intimidation. Ida Tarbell's meticulously documented work becomes part of the evidence. The story she wrote for McClure's magazine is now retold in sworn testimony before judges. Rockefeller, by now in his late 60s, does not appear in court. He has officially retired from active management, handing day-to-day control to his son and trusted executives. Yet his presence hangs over the proceedings like a ghost. To the public, the trial is not about Standard Oil as a corporation. It is about John D. Rockefeller himself, the man who built it, the man whose name is synonymous with monopoly. Standard's lawyers argue fiercely. They insist the company did nothing illegal, that its dominance comes not from unfair practices but from efficiency, innovation, and superior organization. They claim Standard Oil has lowered prices for consumers, improved product quality, and created stability in a chaotic industry. Is that not the very purpose of capitalism? They ask. The government counters with evidence of the rebate system, the Cleveland massacre, the ruthless price wars, the secret arrangements with railroads and pipelines. This is not capitalism, the prosecution declares. This is conquest. This is tyranny in commerce. Outside the courtroom, public opinion is clear. Cartoons depict Rockefeller as a bloated king, his crown labeled Standard Oil, sitting astride the American economy. Crowds cheer Roosevelt's trust-busting crusade. For the first time, the invincible empire of Standard seems vulnerable. In 1911, after nearly 5 years of legal battle, the Supreme Court delivers its verdict. In a landmark decision, the court rules that Standard Oil is guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. The justices describe Standard's tactics as unreasonable restraints of trade, the very abuses the law was meant to stop. The punishment is historic. The court orders Standard Oil to be broken up into 34 separate companies. The empire Rockefeller built over 4 decades is dismantled. The news shocks the world. Newspapers proclaim the end of an era. To reformers, it is a triumph of democracy over monopoly. To Rockefeller's critics, it is justice at last. But to Rockefeller himself, it is merely another turn in the wheel of fortune. When a reporter asks him for his reaction, Rockefeller, by now retired, silver-haired, and serene, simply smiles. "Say," he replies, "that day we dissolved Standard Oil, I made $200 million. And he is not exaggerating. Because Standard's shares are divided among the new companies, Rockefeller, who owns a quarter of Standard, suddenly finds himself holding stock in dozens of corporations: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and more. As the years pass, these companies prosper in the automobile age and Rockefeller's fortune multiplies. What was intended as a punishment becomes, in practice, a financial windfall. Yet the breakup marks a turning point. Rockefeller's power over the oil industry is gone. The age of the all-powerful industrial monopoly is ending. New laws, new regulations, and new political energy ensure that no single man will ever again wield such dominance. For Rockefeller, the decision comes at a moment when his attention is shifting anyway. His health is fragile, his hair gone, his skin pale. He spends less time in boardrooms and more in gardens, walking with his grandchildren, thinking not about pipelines and refineries, but about foundations and universities. The empire he built has been dismantled. But the legacy he is about to construct, the legacy of philanthropy, will prove even more enduring. The year is 1913. John D. Rockefeller is 74 years old. His empire of oil has been broken apart by the Supreme Court, but his fortune, vast beyond imagination, remains intact. In fact, the dissolution of Standard Oil has made him even richer. Shares in the successor companies surge in value as automobiles replace horses and gasoline becomes the lifeblood of the new century. Rockefeller is now the world's first billionaire, his wealth estimated at nearly 2% of the entire U.S. economy. Yet, surprisingly, money holds little meaning for him anymore. His lifestyle is modest. He dresses plainly, eats simple meals, and avoids the flamboyant luxuries of his fellow magnates. He doesn't build marble palaces or collect rare art. Instead, his gaze turns toward a different horizon, one not of conquest but of giving. "God gave me my money," Rockefeller once said. To him, wealth is not simply a reward but a responsibility. He believes that riches, like talent, must be put to use for the betterment of mankind. If in business he sought order from chaos, in philanthropy he seeks the same: method, structure, strategy. Unlike many wealthy men of his time, Rockefeller refuses to scatter his donations in random bursts of generosity. He wants to attack problems at their roots, not just treat the symptoms. This philosophy leads him to create something revolutionary: the Rockefeller Foundation. In 1913, he officially endows the foundation with $100 million, more than $2.6 billion in today's money. Its mission is breathtaking in scope: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Under the guidance of his trusted advisor, Frederick T. Gates, and a board of scientists, educators, and public health experts, the foundation becomes a new kind of institution: part research hub, part relief agency, part engine of innovation. Rockefeller calls it a way to scientifically manage philanthropy. The foundation's first major project is bold: the eradication of hookworm disease. In the American South, millions of children are weakened by this parasitic infection. They are pale, listless, unable to grow properly or learn in school. Most families simply accept it as a fact of life. But Rockefeller's foundation sees a solvable problem. Dr. William Welch, a director of the foundation, presents the case to Rockefeller. It is not like tuberculosis or cancer, where science is still uncertain. With hookworm, we know how to prevent and treat it. We simply need the resources to act. Rockefeller agrees at once. "Draft the proposal," he says. Within months, the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission is born. Teams of doctors and field workers fan out across the South, educating families, treating children, and transforming public health. Within a decade, hookworm is virtually eliminated in the region. This is only the beginning. The Rockefeller Foundation soon tackles yellow fever, malaria, and other global diseases. It funds the creation of schools of public health at Johns Hopkins and Harvard. It supports breakthroughs in medical research, including the development of vaccines. In time, it helps modernize agriculture across the world, laying the groundwork for what will later become known as the Green Revolution. Meanwhile, Rockefeller also invests in education. Through the General Education Board, founded earlier in 1902, he pours hundreds of millions into schools, particularly in the rural South. He believes every child, rich or poor, deserves access to quality education. His money helps fund historically black colleges, normal schools for teachers, and thousands of small rural schools that bring literacy to communities long neglected. In New York, his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., pushes philanthropy into new territory: the arts. At his urging, the family begins supporting projects like the Museum of Modern Art, founded in 1929. Jr. also invests heavily in conservation, preserving vast swaths of American wilderness that will one day become national parks. For the elder Rockefeller, the satisfaction of philanthropy is not in recognition. He rarely attaches his name to gifts, but in results. He likes to see problems solved, diseases eradicated, and institutions strengthened. "Money is like manure," he quips. "It's not worth a thing unless it's spread around encouraging young things to grow." Yet public skepticism lingers. Many still see Rockefeller's philanthropy as an attempt to cleanse his reputation, to buy redemption for the ruthless practices that built his fortune. Critics call him a robber baron turned benefactor. Some accuse him of using philanthropy to mask a legacy of greed. Rockefeller himself shrugs at such accusations. He rarely defends himself in public. To his mind, history will judge him not by words, but by the institutions he leaves behind. At home, he finds peace in simple routines. He rises early, takes walks through his gardens, plays golf, and enjoys time with his grandchildren. Each morning, he reads his Bible, underlining verses about stewardship and humility. Despite the storm of criticism that has followed him for decades, he is content. His health, once fragile, improves in retirement. Free from the stress of daily business, he lives longer than anyone expected. By the time he reaches his 80s, Rockefeller has given away more than $500 million, an astronomical figure in that era, equivalent to tens of billions today. His gifts have reshaped public health, transformed education, and left an indelible mark on science and culture. From the ruthless monopolist of the 1870s, Rockefeller has become, in the eyes of many, one of history's greatest philanthropists. It is a transformation as dramatic as any in American history. A man who built power by crushing competition now devotes his fortune to lifting humanity. But his story is not finished yet. As war clouds gather over Europe and the world plunges into new crises, Rockefeller's foundations will be tested on a global scale. It is the summer of 1914 and Europe is at war. Nations mobilize millions of soldiers, trenches scar the landscape, and disease spreads faster than bullets. Though John D. Rockefeller has stepped away from active business, his influence continues through the Rockefeller Foundation, which quickly pivots to humanitarian relief. One of its earliest initiatives is food aid. Millions in occupied Belgium face starvation under German control. The foundation channels funds to Herbert Hoover's Commission for Relief in Belgium, shipping food across the Atlantic to sustain entire populations. In Rockefeller's study, reports from Europe arrive daily, filled with grim statistics of hunger and death. He reads them silently, nodding when his advisors propose sending more aid. "Do it," he says simply. "If we have the means, we must." The war also accelerates the need for medical breakthroughs. Rockefeller-funded researchers push forward on vaccines, studying diseases that cripple soldiers in the trenches: typhoid, dysentery, influenza. After the conflict ends, the foundation expands globally, establishing medical schools in China, supporting malaria campaigns in Latin America, and training doctors across the developing world. Rockefeller's vision of philanthropy as systematic, scientific, and worldwide begins to take form. By 1916, Rockefeller reaches another milestone. His fortune passes $1 billion, making him the richest man who has ever lived. Adjusted for today, it is the equivalent of nearly $500 billion. And yet, his personal life remains startlingly modest. He continues to live quietly at his estate in Picantico Hills, New York, or in Florida during the winters. He plays golf, tends his gardens, reads scripture, and spends time with his grandchildren. When strangers meet him, they are often struck not by grandeur but by his quiet simplicity. But beneath the calm surface lies reflection. He knows his empire was built with ruthless tactics. He knows critics call him a monopolist, a robber baron. He also knows that through his philanthropy, millions of lives have been saved and countless more improved. Was his path justified? Did the ends balance the means? He rarely answers such questions directly, preferring instead to let his work speak for itself. The 1920s bring new challenges. The automobile age has arrived and oil is more valuable than ever. The successor companies born from the breakup of Standard Oil, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and others, become titans in their own right, dominating global energy markets. Ironically, the antitrust decision that sought to weaken Rockefeller's empire only made him wealthier, as his shares in the new company soared. Public opinion begins to soften. Photographs of the elderly Rockefeller, handing out shiny dimes to children, circulate widely. What once seemed like arrogance now looks like generosity. Newspapers portray him less as a ruthless monopolist and more as a kindly grandfather. Part of this is public relations, managed by Ivy Lee, one of America's first PR experts. But part of it is genuine. Rockefeller has mellowed. The sharp edges of his youth have been worn down by time, faith, and the act of giving. Then comes the Great Depression. Banks collapse, unemployment soars, breadlines stretch for blocks. Many assume Rockefeller will retreat into silence. Instead, he increases his giving. When advisors warn him to preserve his wealth until markets recover, he shakes his head. How many will suffer while we wait? He asks. To him, philanthropy is not about timing the market. It is about meeting need where it exists. By the 1930s, Rockefeller is a living legend. Presidents consult him, kings send him telegrams, universities thank him for endowments. And yet, his greatest pride is not in his wealth or his reputation, but in his family. He takes joy in watching his children and grandchildren carry on his philanthropic work. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., expands into cultural projects like the Museum of Modern Art and large-scale conservation efforts. His grandsons, including Nelson and David, will one day play leading roles in American politics and banking. In May 1937, at the age of 97, Rockefeller's long journey comes to an end. Surrounded by family at his home in Ormond Beach, Florida, he passes away peacefully. The boy who once raised turkeys to sell at market, the bookkeeper who saved every penny, the monopolist who built the most feared corporation in America, and the philanthropist who reshaped medicine and education. His story closes. The obituaries are filled with contradictions. Some call him a ruthless monopolist who bent the nation's economy to his will. Others call him the greatest benefactor the world has ever known. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps that duality is what makes his story enduring. His legacy, however, is undeniable. The Rockefeller Foundation goes on to play a central role in eradicating yellow fever, in funding the green revolution that feeds billions, and in shaping modern medicine and education. The University of Chicago, which he founded, becomes a world-class institution, producing Nobel laureates. The companies born of Standard Oil dominate global energy for a century. And the Rockefeller name, once synonymous with monopoly, becomes equally synonymous with philanthropy. As the sun sets over the Hudson River or rises over the Florida coast, one can imagine Rockefeller in those final years, sitting in quiet reflection. He was never comfortable with praise, never swayed by critics. To him, life was about discipline, faith, and purpose. He built an empire, lost it, and built a legacy that outlived them both. The man who once said, "I am bound to be rich," fulfilled that prophecy beyond measure. But in the end, his wealth was not just money. It was influence, institutions, and an enduring reminder of how one life, contradictory, flawed, yet visionary, can reshape the world. When John D. Rockefeller passed away in May 1937 at the age of 97, it felt as if an era of American history had closed. Newspapers across the world ran lengthy obituaries, weighing his ruthless business practices against his unmatched philanthropy. For some, he would forever be the robber baron, the monopolist who strangled competitors. For others, he had become a saintly benefactor, a man who had turned extraordinary wealth into extraordinary giving. For his family, though, his passing meant something both intimate and monumental: the responsibility of managing not just a fortune but a legacy. John D. Rockefeller Jr., his only son, now carried the full burden of guiding the Rockefeller philanthropic institutions. Unlike his father, Jr. was not a ruthless businessman. He had never craved the thrill of corporate battles, nor had he cultivated the same aura of fear. Instead, he was deeply conscientious, almost painfully so. Friends and observers often described him as solemn, serious, and devout. If Rockefeller Sr. had built the machine of wealth, Jr.'s mission was to steer it toward humanity's service. By 1937, the Rockefeller Foundation was already active across the globe, funding projects in medicine, education, and public health. The timing of Rockefeller's death coincided with the rumblings of global crisis. Within 2 years, World War II erupted in Europe, and the world plunged into chaos once again. Though Rockefeller himself would never see it, the institutions he founded would play a vital role in the war years. The Rockefeller Foundation supported refugee scholars fleeing Nazi persecution, helping hundreds of scientists, writers, and academics relocate to the United States. Many of these intellectuals went on to make critical contributions to medicine, physics, and the humanities. Without Rockefeller funding, some of the brightest minds of the 20th century might have been lost to history. The foundation also turned its attention to war relief efforts. In Belgium and France, occupied by German forces, millions of civilians faced starvation. Working in cooperation with the American Relief Administration led by Herbert Hoover, Rockefeller money helped ship food, medicine, and supplies to devastated populations. It was philanthropy at a scale few governments could even match, and it demonstrated how private wealth, strategically deployed, could ease suffering on a global scale. Back in the United States, Jr. continued to expand the family's influence. He financed the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, transforming the Virginia town into a living museum of American history. He funded the construction of Rockefeller Center in New York City, a project his father never would have indulged in, but which became a symbol of American optimism during the Depression and beyond. To Jr., these projects were not indulgences. They were expressions of civic responsibility, meant to inspire national pride and cultural preservation. At the same time, Jr. carried forward his father's philanthropic precision. He believed in addressing root causes, not just temporary relief. This philosophy was visible in the Rockefeller Foundation's campaigns against malaria in Latin America, yellow fever in the Caribbean, and famine in Asia. Though the world was at war, the Foundation's long view was clear. Global health was as vital to peace as political treaties or military victories. Yet Jr. also faced personal and political pressures. The scale of the Rockefeller fortune drew criticism in a time when economic inequality was again under scrutiny. Some accused the family of using philanthropy to mask capitalist excess. Others questioned whether unelected, unaccountable foundations should wield so much influence over public life. These debates foreshadowed modern controversies about billionaire philanthropy. Within the family itself, the torch was quietly beginning to pass to the next generation. Rockefeller's grandsons, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, David, and John III, were coming of age. Each would carry the name into different arenas: politics, banking, conservation, and art. They were born into privilege but also into responsibility. The Rockefeller name was no longer just about Standard Oil. It was about foundations, universities, hospitals, museums, and international influence. By the time the Second World War drew to a close in 1945, the Rockefeller institutions were more global than ever. They had supported famine relief in China, rebuilt schools in war-torn Europe, and trained doctors across Latin America. While John D. Rockefeller himself had been gone for nearly a decade, his shadow still loomed large. The fortune he created through ruthless consolidation was now fueling projects that shaped the modern world. The paradox deepened. Was Rockefeller's greatest achievement his creation of Standard Oil, or the philanthropic empire that followed? The answer seemed to shift depending on who was asked. But one thing was certain. By the mid-20th century, the Rockefeller story had become less about one man and more about a dynasty, one that would continue shaping America and the world for generations. The war had ended. In 1945, the streets of New York filled with parades, confetti, and cheers as the Allies declared victory. While much of the world lay in ruins, America emerged as the new global superpower, its economy intact, its influence unrivaled. And in the center of this shifting landscape stood the Rockefeller family, not just as heirs to wealth, but as architects of America's new role on the world stage. John D. Rockefeller Jr., now in his 70s, bore the weight of both legacy and expectation. He was the custodian of his father's fortune and institutions, and the war had only amplified their global reach. The Rockefeller Foundation had funded wartime relief in Europe, medical campaigns in Asia, and agricultural programs in Latin America. With peace came new opportunities and new responsibilities. In the late 1940s, the Rockefeller Foundation played a role in what would later be called the Green Revolution. Working with scientists in Mexico, it supported research into high-yield crops, improved farming techniques, and the development of resilient wheat and corn strains. These agricultural breakthroughs promised to combat famine on a massive scale, particularly in developing nations. The echoes of Rockefeller's obsession with efficiency and growth could be felt in every seed planted. At home, the Rockefeller name became increasingly tied to institutions that defined American life. The University of Chicago, founded decades earlier with Rockefeller money, was producing groundbreaking work in physics and economics, so much so that it became central to the Manhattan Project, the effort that developed the atomic bomb. Ironically, the wealth from oil had now helped finance the science that ended the war with nuclear fire. But it wasn't just the foundation that carried the Rockefeller banner forward. The next generation, the grandsons of John D. were stepping into the spotlight. Each carved a different path, yet together they gave the Rockefeller dynasty influence in nearly every sphere of American life. Nelson Rockefeller, charismatic and ambitious, moved into politics. In the late 1940s, he worked in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, focusing on Latin America. Fluent in Spanish, he charmed leaders across the region, while pushing for American business expansion. Later, his political career would take him all the way to the governorship of New York and eventually the vice presidency of the United States. Lawrence Rockefeller found his passion in conservation and the environment. While his grandfather had been associated with oil wells and pipelines, Lawrence envisioned parks, open spaces, and ecological preservation. He became one of the earliest advocates for environmental responsibility among America's elite, funding conservation projects across the country. Winthrop Rockefeller, perhaps the most unconventional of the brothers, distanced himself from Wall Street and the family's traditional pursuits. He eventually moved to Arkansas, where he entered politics as a reformer, challenging the old segregationist system. His work laid part of the groundwork for the modern South. David Rockefeller, the youngest and perhaps most polished, built his career in banking. At Chase Manhattan Bank, he rose steadily through the ranks, eventually becoming one of the most influential bankers in the world. His ability to blend financial acumen with diplomatic skill made him a key figure in international relations throughout the Cold War. And then there was John D. Rockefeller III, the eldest grandson, who dedicated himself to philanthropy, particularly in the fields of population control and the arts. His quiet, steady work helped expand the family's reach into cultural diplomacy and humanitarian causes. By the late 1940s, the Rockefellers were no longer just wealthy. They were a dynasty embedded in America's political, cultural, and financial DNA. The family had gone from one ruthless oil magnate to a sprawling web of influence. In government, in finance, in science, in philanthropy, in global affairs. Yet, with this prominence came new challenges. The post-war years were also the dawn of the Cold War. Questions of capitalism versus communism, private wealth versus public good, grew louder. Critics of concentrated power looked at the Rockefellers and saw unelected monarchs of American society. Was it right, they asked, for one family to wield so much influence simply because of inherited fortune? But the Rockefellers themselves seemed determined to redefine what that influence meant. Where John D. Sr. had once been caricatured as an octopus strangling competition, his heirs sought to present themselves as benefactors, builders, and servants of the public good. Nelson promoted democracy in Latin America. Lawrence preserved America's natural treasures. David traveled the globe building ties with foreign leaders. Junior funded churches, cultural landmarks, and education. The dynasty was evolving. The world of cutthroat oil wars and railroad rebates had given way to a different kind of power. Soft power exercised through philanthropy, diplomacy, and cultural investment. And in this new age of American dominance, the Rockefellers were not merely spectators. They were active participants in shaping the 20th century. As the 1950s approached, one thing was clear. John D. Rockefeller's shadow stretched far beyond his lifetime. His heirs were ensuring that the Rockefeller name remained synonymous not only with wealth, but with influence, vision, and, increasingly, a responsibility to the wider world. The 1950s dawned with a strange mixture of hope and fear. The Second World War was over, but a new kind of conflict had begun. One without traditional battlefields, fought instead with ideology, influence, and the looming threat of nuclear annihilation. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was not just a clash of nations, but a contest for the future of humanity. And in this uncertain new world, the Rockefeller family's power and reach became more visible than ever. For John D. Rockefeller Jr., now well into his twilight years, the family's legacy was no longer simply about wealth. It was about responsibility. He had overseen the creation of Rockefeller Center in New York, a towering symbol of American progress and commerce. Now, as America squared off against communism, the Rockefellers' resources were being funneled into institutions designed to strengthen democracy, advance global health, and demonstrate the cultural power of the West. The Rockefeller Foundation expanded aggressively into international programs during these decades. One of its key initiatives was supporting agricultural development abroad. Building on its earlier work in Mexico, it helped establish the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines in 1960. The goal was ambitious: to prevent famine in Asia by creating more productive rice varieties. The Green Revolution, as it came to be called, would soon change the diets and lives of billions. To Rockefeller planners, this was more than humanitarian work. It was a way to blunt the appeal of communism in poor nations by ensuring people had food and stability. Meanwhile, the Rockefeller grandsons came fully into their own. Each was a player in Cold War America in different arenas. Nelson Rockefeller was perhaps the most visible. In 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower appointed him as Undersecretary of Health, Education and Welfare, and later as a Special Assistant for Foreign Affairs. Nelson had a talent for showmanship and charisma that made him a natural in politics. He promoted a vision of American leadership in Latin America, arguing that economic aid and cultural exchange were more effective than military force in countering communism. In the 1950s and 60s, he pushed programs that would later evolve into what President Kennedy called the Alliance for Progress. But Nelson also harbored bigger ambitions. In the 1960s, he launched several campaigns for the Republican presidential nomination, positioning himself as a moderate alternative to the party's conservative wing. Though he never captured the nomination, his bids cemented the Rockefeller name in national politics. For his critics, Nelson was proof that the Rockefellers wanted not only economic power, but political office as well. David Rockefeller, the banker, wielded quieter but perhaps even greater influence. Rising through the ranks of Chase Manhattan Bank, he cultivated relationships with world leaders from Europe to Latin America to Asia. Fluent in French, comfortable in diplomatic circles, David turned banking into a tool of international policy. His meetings with foreign ministers and presidents blurred the line between finance and diplomacy, making him one of the most connected Americans of his generation. In the eyes of some, he became a kind of shadow statesman for U.S. capitalism. Lawrence Rockefeller pursued his passion for conservation. At a time when the environment was not yet a global issue, Lawrence funded national parks, wilderness preserves, and ecological research. In 1955, he became the chairman of the Outdoor Recreation Resources Review Commission, which helped expand America's national park system. While his brothers moved in banking and politics, Lawrence left his mark on America's landscape itself, ensuring that future generations would inherit the beauty of its natural spaces. Winthrop Rockefeller took a different path. Moving to Arkansas in the 1950s, he shocked locals by embracing reform politics in a deeply conservative state. Winthrop championed civil rights, modernization, and economic development in a region still struggling with segregation and poverty. By 1967, he was elected governor of Arkansas, the first Republican to hold that office since Reconstruction. His tenure, though brief, symbolized a Rockefeller willingness to engage in transformative politics far from the family's East Coast base. Then there was John D. Rockefeller III, the cultural visionary. In 1952, he founded the Asia Society, an organization aimed at promoting understanding between the United States and Asia at a time when the region was increasingly critical to Cold War strategy. He also played a leading role in the creation of the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in New York, a project that symbolized America's cultural sophistication during a time when soft power was as important as missiles. Together, the brothers represented a kind of diversified portfolio of influence. One in politics, one in banking, one in conservation, one in state leadership, one in culture. Each carried a piece of the Rockefeller legacy into a different corner of American and global life. But this prominence attracted critics. In an era of heightened suspicion of elite power, conspiracy theories began to swirl. Some whispered about the Rockefellers' role in shaping U.S. foreign policy behind the scenes. Books and pamphlets accused them of plotting a new world order through financial and philanthropic networks. Though largely unfounded, these accusations reflected a growing unease with the sheer scope of their influence. By the mid-1960s, the Rockefellers were not just the richest family in America, they were a symbol of American power itself. Their fingerprints were on food production, international banking, cultural institutions, environmental preservation, and high politics. The name Rockefeller meant wealth, yes, but it also meant access, authority, and reach across continents. In the shadows of the nuclear standoff, as American presidents grappled with crises from Cuba to Vietnam, the Rockefellers quietly continued their work, shaping the world not with armies but with ideas, investments, and diplomacy. The dynasty that had begun with a poor boy chasing turkeys in rural New York was now interwoven with the destiny of the modern United States. And yet, as the 1960s progressed, cracks began to appear. Scandals, shifting politics, and the Cultural Revolution would test whether even the Rockefellers could adapt to a rapidly changing America. The 1960s were unlike any decade America had ever seen. The nation was in upheaval. Civil rights marches filled the streets. College campuses erupted in protest over Vietnam. New music, new movements, new attitudes challenged the traditions of the past. For the Rockefellers, symbols of establishment power, this was both an opportunity and a threat. They could step in to guide America through its turbulence, but they also risked being seen as relics of a fading order. Nelson Rockefeller was the most determined to seize the moment. Already serving as governor of New York, he presented himself as a pragmatic, moderate Republican, a man who believed government could be a force for progress. In an era when conservatives like Barry Goldwater demanded smaller government and liberals like Lyndon Johnson pushed sweeping federal programs, Nelson positioned himself in the middle ground. As governor, he poured billions into infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Under his leadership, New York built massive housing projects, expanded its state university system, and invested in public works on a scale rivaled only by the federal government. For some, this was proof that Nelson Rockefeller was a visionary who could modernize American society. For others, it was reckless spending, an empire built on borrowed money that left New York drowning in debt for decades to come. Nelson also made bold moves on civil rights. While many governors in the South resisted integration, he welcomed Martin Luther King Jr. to New York and supported efforts to expand opportunities for Black Americans. These stances won him allies among progressives but fueled suspicion among conservative Republicans. His eyes, however, were fixed on the White House. He ran for president in 1960, 1964, and 1968, hoping to become the first Rockefeller in the Oval Office. But despite his resources, charisma, and influence, he never succeeded. In 1964, he lost the Republican nomination to Barry Goldwater, whose conservative base distrusted Nelson's big government style. In 1968, he entered the race too late, leaving the field to Richard Nixon. Time and again, Nelson's ambition collided with political reality. He was popular in elite circles but could not win the trust of middle America. While Nelson fought for political power, David Rockefeller deepened his role as an unofficial diplomat. As chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, he traveled constantly, meeting with kings, presidents, and prime ministers. He understood that in a Cold War world, money and trade were as powerful as armies. His meetings often blurred the line between business and geopolitics. When he visited Latin America, for instance, his presence was both a banking mission and a signal of U.S. interest in the region. Yet David's global ties also brought controversy. He met leaders in countries where dictators ruled with iron fists, raising questions about whether the Rockefellers cared more about stability and profit than democracy. Still, David insisted that dialogue, even with America's adversaries, was necessary to keep the world from sliding into chaos. Meanwhile, Winthrop Rockefeller made history in the South. Elected governor of Arkansas in 1966, he became a symbol of change in a region still clinging to segregation. He pushed for prison reform, improved healthcare, and greater racial equality. For a time, he seemed like proof that even the old bastions of the Confederacy could embrace progress. But his reforms met fierce resistance from entrenched interests, and his tenure was marked by constant battles with the state legislature. Lawrence Rockefeller pursued quieter but equally transformative goals. His passion for conservation grew in urgency as industrialization spread across the country. He funneled millions into parks, wilderness reserves, and environmental programs, laying the groundwork for the broader environmental movement of the 1970s. His work anticipated the rise of Earth Day and new federal protections for land, water, and air. John D. Rockefeller III expanded his focus on culture and population. In 1965, he helped create the Population Council, an organization dedicated to addressing overpopulation through family planning and reproductive health. At a time when global population was surging, this work was controversial but seen by many as essential to preventing famine and instability. He also poured energy into the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, turning New York into a cultural capital to rival Paris or London. But for all these achievements, the Rockefellers could not escape the growing distrust of elites. The counterculture of the 1960s rejected everything the family represented: corporate power, political ambition, old money, and authority. Protesters denounced them as part of the establishment. Conspiracy theorists painted them as puppet masters behind world events. To radicals, the name Rockefeller was shorthand for the very system they wanted to overthrow. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 and the violence at the Democratic National Convention that same year showed just how deeply fractured America had become. In this chaos, Nelson Rockefeller believed he could present himself as a unifier, a wealthy patrician who nonetheless understood social responsibility. But once again, Nixon outmaneuvered him, seizing the Republican nomination and the presidency. By the early 1970s, Nelson remained governor of New York, but his presidential dreams were slipping away. David continued to expand Chase Manhattan's influence, Lawrence protected the environment, Winthrop fought his political battles in Arkansas, and John D. III pursued philanthropy. The dynasty remained powerful, but the world was shifting. No longer did the Rockefeller name inspire awe alone. It provoked debate, suspicion, even hostility. In a society tearing itself apart over war, race, and inequality, could one of America's richest families still claim to represent the public good? The answer would come in the decades ahead as the Rockefellers faced scandals, shifting politics, and a world increasingly skeptical of concentrated power. But for now, in the storm of the 1960s, they stood as both symbols of continuity and targets of rebellion, giants straddling an uncertain era. The dawn of the 1970s brought a sense of disillusionment to America. The Vietnam War dragged on, costing lives and treasure. Trust in government was eroding. Social unrest lingered, and a shadow of cynicism crept over the nation. For the Rockefellers, the decade would prove to be one of both opportunity and humiliation, a test of whether their names still carried weight in a fractured America. At the center of the family's political fortunes was Nelson Rockefeller, still governor of New York and still chasing the elusive dream of the presidency. He launched yet another campaign for the Republican nomination in 1972, but the mood of the country had shifted. The conservative wing of the Republican Party, energized by voters tired of liberal policies, had little patience for Nelson's brand of moderate, big-spending republicanism. Richard Nixon, already firmly in control of the party, brushed him aside. But Nixon's second term collapsed in scandal. The Watergate break-in and cover-up consumed Washington, unraveling the presidency. When Nixon resigned in 1974, America faced a crisis of confidence. Gerald Ford, the mild-mannered congressman elevated to the vice presidency after Spiro Agnew's resignation, suddenly became president. Ford knew he needed to project stability. He also needed a new vice president. And in a surprising twist, he turned to Nelson Rockefeller. The announcement shocked both parties. Conservatives loathed Nelson, calling him too liberal and too tied to Wall Street. Liberals distrusted him as a symbol of corporate America. But Ford believed Rockefeller's experience and gravitas could reassure the country. The confirmation hearings, however, were brutal. Senators grilled Nelson about his immense wealth, his extensive art collection, and his use of political influence. Critics painted him as an out-of-touch plutocrat trying to buy political office. His donations to public figures and institutions, acts he viewed as philanthropy, were cast as evidence of political manipulation. The hearings exposed the deep suspicion many Americans felt toward concentrated wealth and power. Nevertheless, in December 1974, Nelson Rockefeller was sworn in as Vice President of the United States. For the first time in history, a Rockefeller stood just one heartbeat away from the presidency. Yet the office he had craved for decades came to him not through the ballot box, but through appointment in a time of crisis. As vice president, Nelson was eager to play an active role. He pushed for strong defense spending, advocated for aggressive foreign policy, and promoted domestic programs similar to those he had championed in New York. But President Ford kept him on a tight leash. Ford's advisors worried that Nelson's outsized personality would overshadow the president. The rivalry became obvious, and Nelson was often excluded from key decisions. For the Rockefellers, it was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, Nelson had finally reached the highest levels of government, fulfilling a family ambition that had lingered since John D. Rockefeller Jr. began shaping his children's futures. On the other hand, it was clear that Nelson's time in power would be limited and constrained. In 1976, as Ford sought election in his own right, he decided to drop Nelson from the ticket in favor of Kansas Senator Bob Dole, a move meant to placate the Republican Party's conservative base. Nelson Rockefeller, once the most ambitious of the brothers, saw his national political career come to a quiet and humiliating end. Meanwhile, David Rockefeller continued to expand Chase Manhattan's global influence. During the 1970s, he became perhaps the most internationally connected banker in the world. He met with world leaders across Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. His banking missions often doubled as diplomatic overtures, earning him both admiration and suspicion. When he argued for engagement with China, for example, some saw him as a visionary anticipating future U.S.-China relations. Others accused him of putting corporate interests above national security. At home, Lawrence Rockefeller deepened his commitment to environmental causes, quietly funding conservation projects as America grappled with pollution, oil spills, and the first Earth Day in 1970. His efforts aligned with a growing environmental movement, one that challenged the very fossil fuel industry that had built the family's fortune. Winthrop Rockefeller, however, would not live to see the decade's end. After serving as governor of Arkansas, he battled illness and passed away in 1973 at the age of 60. His legacy as a reformer in the South, rare for a Rockefeller, was honored, but his death reminded the family of their own mortality. John D. Rockefeller III faced tragedy. In 1978, he was killed in a car accident at age 72. His work in population studies and culture had often been overshadowed by his brother's higher-profile careers, but his sudden death underscored the fragility of even the most powerful dynasties. By the late 1970s, the Rockefeller family had achieved remarkable visibility but also faced limits to their influence. Nelson's political career was over. David remained powerful but controversial. Lawrence's conservation work resonated with a younger generation but lacked the glamour of politics or banking. The family still carried immense wealth and status, but their role in American life was changing. In many ways, the 1970s marked the end of an era. The Rockefellers could no longer claim dominance in the way John D. Sr. once had. They were players, yes, but no longer kings. The country was too diverse, too skeptical, too fragmented to accept the unchallenged influence of a single family. And yet, the Rockefeller name endured. Whether in politics, finance, or philanthropy, their presence was still felt. Their story was far from over. The question was whether future generations could adapt to a world where dynasties were no longer trusted, and where wealth brought as much suspicion as admiration. The 1980s arrived with a burst of optimism and boldness. Ronald Reagan promised morning in America, Wall Street was booming, and the country embraced a new brand of capitalism. It was a time of deregulation, corporate takeovers, and larger-than-life business figures who became celebrities in their own right. In this atmosphere, the Rockefellers, once the undisputed symbol of American wealth, faced a paradox. They were still immensely powerful but no longer at the center of the story. America had produced a new generation of billionaires, and the Rockefeller dynasty was forced to adapt to a changing stage. David Rockefeller, the most prominent of his generation, remained the family's public face. As chairman and CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank until his retirement in 1981, he had transformed the bank into one of the largest financial institutions in the world. His international connections were unmatched. He had dined with kings, debated with prime ministers, and met dictators from Latin America to the Middle East. To some, he embodied the idea of the global elite, a man whose influence spanned beyond national borders. But in the 1980s, that image attracted suspicion. As conspiracy theories about shadowy networks of bankers and politicians grew, David often found himself the target. Books and pamphlets accused him of controlling world governments, manipulating markets, even plotting world domination. Though exaggerated, these rumors reflected a deeper truth. The Rockefellers were no longer just admired, they were resented by many who viewed them as the face of entrenched privilege. At the same time, David worked to defend the family's legacy. He helped establish the Trilateral Commission in 1973, bringing together leaders from North America, Europe, and Asia to promote cooperation in an interdependent world. By the 1980s, the Commission was criticized as an elitist club, but it continued to influence policy debates at the highest levels. David believed that global challenges, whether economic instability or energy crises, required global solutions, even if the public was uneasy about unelected figures shaping world affairs. Meanwhile, the family's philanthropy remained strong. The Rockefeller Foundation adapted to new issues, funding research into emerging diseases like HIV/AIDS, supporting economic development in Africa, and advancing agricultural programs in Asia. The shift reflected a new reality. Rockefeller money was no longer focused on America alone, but on the challenges of an interconnected world. The younger Rockefellers also stepped forward. Nelson Rockefeller's death in 1979 had ended the political ambitions of the most visible brother, but his children and grandchildren remained active. Some pursued business, others philanthropy, others public service. The dynasty was sprawling, less centralized, but still unified by wealth and name recognition. Lawrence Rockefeller, still alive and active, leaned into the environmental movement. As concern for conservation grew in the 1980s, he was recognized as a pioneer. His efforts in national parks and wilderness preservation aligned perfectly with the era's rising environmental consciousness. While Reagan's administration often clashed with environmentalists, Lawrence's philanthropy ensured that critical lands were protected for future generations. Yet, for all their contributions, the Rockefellers could not avoid the changing cultural tide. The 1980s were about brash, individual success stories, men like Donald Trump, Ted Turner, and corporate raiders who made headlines with bold deals. In this new age of flamboyant capitalism, the Rockefellers seemed almost old-fashioned. Their style was understated, institutional, cautious. For a public fascinated by flashy wealth, the family's quiet power didn't always capture the imagination. Still, they remained fixtures in American life. The family's New York landmarks, the towering Rockefeller Center, the Museum of Modern Art, Lincoln Center, stood as daily reminders of their enduring presence. Tourists skated beneath the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Plaza, perhaps unaware of the dynasty's full history, but instinctively recognizing the name as synonymous with power and tradition. The 1980s also marked a subtle transition from the third to the fourth generation of Rockefellers. David, Lawrence, and John D.'s children were stepping into leadership roles in philanthropy, business, and cultural institutions. But the younger generation faced a dilemma: how to remain relevant in a world where inherited wealth was increasingly viewed with suspicion, even disdain. America was becoming fascinated by the self-made billionaire, the tech innovator, the entrepreneur who rose from nothing. The Rockefellers were no longer the underdog success story, they were the establishment. This shift in perception mattered. In the 19th century, John D. Rockefeller Sr. had been vilified for his ruthless business tactics but respected for his vision. In the mid-20th century, the family's philanthropy had softened their image, turning them into symbols of public service. But by the 1980s, the pendulum had swung again. The Rockefellers were seen by many not as innovators, but as relics of an older, elitist order. And yet, the family's influence endured. They remained deeply embedded in finance, politics, culture, and international diplomacy. Their institutions continued to shape global health, education, and the arts. The Rockefellers were no longer the undisputed rulers of wealth in America, but they had become something just as powerful: a permanent fixture of the American story, a dynasty that had outlasted its rivals and adapted to each new age. As the decade closed, Wall Street roared through a boom and bust cycle, culminating in the crash of 1987. Once again, the Rockefellers' conservative financial philosophy insulated them from the worst of it. They had lived through panics, depressions, and wars. This too was just another cycle. But beneath the surface, questions loomed. Could a family dynasty built on oil wealth in the 19th century continue to shape the 21st? Or would the Rockefeller name slowly fade into a symbol of the past? The answer would come in the decades to follow as the fourth and fifth generations of Rockefellers navigated a new America, one where technology, not oil, would define the future. The 1990s opened with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the dawn of a new global order. America stood alone as the world's superpower. Technology was transforming economies, globalization was accelerating, and a new wave of billionaires, software tycoons, and entrepreneurs began reshaping the landscape of wealth. For the Rockefellers, this was a moment of both challenge and renewal. Their fortune had been built on oil, banking, and industry. But to remain relevant, the family had to reinvent its role in a rapidly changing world. David Rockefeller, the last surviving grandson of John D. Sr., was in his twilight years but remained remarkably active. In his 80s, he still traveled widely, meeting with world leaders and participating in global conferences. His stature as an elder statesman of finance gave him unparalleled access. He spoke about the need for cooperation in an interconnected world, arguing that global problems, economic crises, environmental issues, public health, could only be solved through international collaboration. But as David's prominence endured, attention increasingly shifted to the fourth generation of Rockefellers. His children, nieces, nephews, and cousins, who carried the name into the modern era. Unlike their ancestors, most did not pursue dominance in business or politics. Instead, they focused on philanthropy, culture, and social causes. This was a deliberate choice. They understood that in an era of growing skepticism toward inherited wealth, their legitimacy depended not on how much money they had, but on what they did with it. Stephen Rockefeller, a professor and theologian, took on issues of spirituality and the environment. He became deeply involved in drafting the Earth Charter, a declaration of global interdependence and ecological responsibility that sought to guide humanity into the 21st century. For him, carrying the Rockefeller legacy meant not building banks or oil companies, but articulating a vision of ethical responsibility for the planet. Peggy Delaney Rockefeller, David's daughter, founded the Synergos Institute in 1986, which grew in the 1990s into a major player in global philanthropy. Synergos specialized in building partnerships between governments, businesses, and civil society organizations to address poverty and social inequality. Her approach reflected a shift in philanthropy, away from top-down institutions and toward collaborative networks. J. Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller IV, a descendant of John D. Jr., pursued a career in politics. By the 1990s, he was serving as a U.S. Senator from West Virginia, a position he would hold for 3 decades. Unlike Nelson, Jay never sought the presidency, but he became a respected figure in Congress, especially on issues of health, veterans affairs, and intelligence oversight. He represented a quieter, steadier form of political service compared to his more flamboyant relatives. Other members of the family engaged in environmentalism, the arts, and community development. Collectively, the Rockefellers seemed less concerned with consolidating power and more focused on diversifying their influence. The family's vast wealth, spread across trusts, endowments, and investments, ensured that resources were available for new ventures. But the tone had shifted. The Rockefellers were no longer trying to dominate industries, they were trying to shape conversations. Meanwhile, the Rockefeller Foundation itself underwent transformation. In the 1990s, it became increasingly global, funding efforts to fight HIV/AIDS in Africa, supporting agricultural research in Asia, and investing in urban development projects in Latin America. It embraced the idea of venture philanthropy, seeking measurable returns on social investments in the same way a business might evaluate profits. The Foundation's work demonstrated how far the family had traveled from John D. Sr.'s ruthless monopoly building, yet how much they still relied on his methodical, results-oriented philosophy. But the 1990s also revealed the limits of legacy. In an age dominated by Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and other tech-driven billionaires, the Rockefellers no longer stood at the top of the wealth pyramid. Their fortune, while still enormous, was spread across hundreds of descendants. No single Rockefeller ranked among the richest individuals on the planet. The family's name still carried prestige, but it no longer commanded awe through sheer financial dominance. Public perception reflected this shift. To older generations, Rockefeller still meant oil, power, and unimaginable riches. To younger Americans, the name was just one among many in the pantheon of wealthy families, sharing space with the Gateses, Waltons, and Jobses. The Rockefellers were respected but not feared, admired but not envied. They had become a dynasty of tradition rather than revolution. Still, their institutions gave them enduring relevance. The Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller University, the Museum of Modern Art, the Asia Society, all stood as monuments to their influence. Their philanthropy continued to touch millions of lives worldwide. Even if they no longer set the terms of capitalism, they remained embedded in its cultural and humanitarian framework. In many ways, this was the reinvention John D. Sr. himself might have wanted. His fortune, accumulated through ruthless competition, had been transmuted into institutions designed to outlive him. The family no longer had to control the oil market or dominate Wall Street to matter. Their legacy lived on in the networks of philanthropy, policy, and culture they had built. As the 1990s closed, the Rockefellers entered the 21st century not as the world's wealthiest family, but as one of its most enduring. Their role had shifted from empire builders to legacy stewards, from monopolists to philanthropists, from symbols of concentrated wealth to advocates for global responsibility. The question for the new century was whether this transformation would be enough. Could the Rockefellers remain relevant in a digital age shaped by entirely new forces of wealth and power? Or would they finally fade into the background, their institutions respected but their name no longer commanding the same weight it once had? The dawn of the 21st century brought with it a new set of realities even John D. Rockefeller Sr., with all his foresight, could never have imagined. The new century was defined not by oil or railroads, but by technology, terrorism, and a demand for accountability in ways that challenged old dynasties. For the Rockefellers, the 2000s were a test of endurance, adaptation, and legacy management. The decade began with optimism. The Cold War was over, globalization was accelerating, and the world seemed poised for prosperity. But the events of September 11, 2001 changed everything. The attacks in New York City and Washington shook America to its core, bringing questions of security, stability, and resilience to the forefront. For the Rockefellers, whose name was etched into New York's very skyline, the tragedy struck close to home. Rockefeller Center, though not directly targeted, became a symbol of the city's determination to endure. David Rockefeller, then in his late 80s, publicly expressed grief but also resilience. He reminded New Yorkers that the city had faced crises before: the Depression, World War II, financial collapse, and had always risen again. His calm, grandfatherly presence offered reassurance at a time of fear and uncertainty. But beyond symbolic gestures, the family faced a broader question. How would their institutions respond to a changed world? The Rockefeller Foundation pivoted quickly. It funded projects aimed at improving urban resilience, public health systems, and global security networks. In the wake of 9/11, the foundation explored ways to strengthen communities against terrorism, pandemics, and natural disasters. Its investments in global health became more urgent than ever, focusing on infectious disease prevention and expanding access to healthcare in developing nations. Meanwhile, the world of wealth was changing around them. The tech boom of the late 1990s had created a new class of billionaires. Names like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and later Jeff Bezos began to eclipse the Rockefellers in public imagination. These were not heirs to dynasties. They were self-made innovators, entrepreneurs whose wealth came not from inheritance but from disruption. The contrast was stark. While the Rockefellers embodied stability, tradition, and institutional philanthropy, the new billionaires represented speed, risk, and radical change. The Rockefellers responded not by trying to compete in tech, but by repositioning their role. They leaned into philanthropy, environmentalism, and advocacy, areas where their name carried credibility. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund expanded its work on democracy, peace building, and sustainable development. Several family members became outspoken advocates for combating climate change, investing in renewable energy, and even questioning the legacy of oil that had built their fortune in the first place. This pivot was not without irony. In 2004, the Rockefeller family pressed ExxonMobil, one of the direct descendants of Standard Oil, to acknowledge and address climate change. Publicly challenging the oil giant symbolized how far the dynasty had traveled from John D. Sr.'s empire building to a 21st century commitment to sustainability. Some critics accused the family of hypocrisy. Others praised them for evolving with the times. Either way, it showed that the Rockefellers were unwilling to be locked in the past. At the same time, transparency became a pressing issue. The rise of the internet, investigative journalism, and watchdog groups meant that powerful families could no longer operate in secrecy. Where once John D. Sr. could wield influence behind closed doors, his descendants now had to contend with public scrutiny on every front. The Rockefellers adapted by embracing openness. They published more information about their foundations, opened archives to researchers, and presented themselves as thought leaders rather than hidden power brokers. Generational change was also underway. The fifth and even sixth generations of Rockefellers began to take on leadership roles. Unlike their ancestors, they grew up in a world where the Rockefeller name was less about awe and more about responsibility. Many pursued careers outside the spotlight, working in nonprofits, academia, or social ventures. The family fortune, though still vast, had been divided among hundreds of heirs, meaning that wealth alone no longer defined their identity. Instead, they sought to carry forward the values of service, philanthropy, and stewardship. Yet, the Rockefellers remained deeply embedded in American institutions. Rockefeller University continued to produce Nobel Prize-winning research. The Museum of Modern Art expanded its global influence in the art world. The family's conservation efforts protected millions of acres of land. And in politics, J. Rockefeller remained a respected senator, advocating for health care reform, veteran support, and government accountability until his retirement in 2015. By the end of the 2000s, the Rockefellers were no longer the richest family in America. They were no longer the central players in business or politics. But they had something few dynasties ever achieve: continuity. More than a century after John D. Sr. built his first refinery in Cleveland, the Rockefeller name was still tied to power, philanthropy, and influence. They had survived the breakup of Standard Oil, the Great Depression, the counterculture revolts, Watergate, the rise of new billionaires, and the demand for transparency in the digital age. The oil barons' descendants had not vanished into obscurity. They had adapted, reshaped, and redefined themselves again and again. As the century turned, a question lingered. In a world defined by technology, networks, and transparency, what role would the Rockefellers play? Could they remain influential in shaping global policy, philanthropy, and culture? Or would their story become a historical relic, overshadowed by the Silicon Valley titans of a new era? For now, their institutions remained strong, their name carried weight, and their legacy was still being written. The 2010s began with a stark new reality. Wealth was no longer concentrated in dynasties like the Rockefellers, but in the hands of tech moguls who seemed to remake the world overnight. Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. These names captured headlines as symbols of innovation and disruption. Against this backdrop, the Rockefeller family, now in its fifth and sixth generations, faced a daunting question. How could they remain relevant in a world where oil was no longer king, and inherited wealth often drew more criticism than admiration? The answer came through a bold and unexpected move. In 2014, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund made international headlines by announcing that it would divest from fossil fuels. The decision was staggering in its symbolism. Here was the family whose fortune had been built on oil, publicly turning its back on the industry that had made them rich. To environmental activists, it was a watershed moment. If the Rockefellers could acknowledge the dangers of climate change and move away from fossil fuels, surely the rest of the financial world could follow. This decision did not come out of nowhere. For decades, family members like Stephen Rockefeller and Peggy Delaney had been advocating for sustainability and global cooperation. But in the 2010s, climate change became an undeniable reality. Rising sea levels, record temperatures, and devastating natural disasters dominated the news. The Rockefellers seized the moment to reposition themselves not as relics of an oil age, but as leaders in the fight for a sustainable future. The divestment was also a signal to the younger generations. It showed that the family was willing to confront its own complicated legacy, acknowledging the damage oil had done to the planet while using their resources to promote renewable energy, environmental justice, and green technology. In doing so, they rebranded themselves for the 21st century, not as oil barons but as environmental stewards. Meanwhile, their philanthropic institutions continued to evolve. The Rockefeller Foundation invested in public health initiatives, including pandemic preparedness, a prescient focus that would become critical in the next decade. It supported economic development programs in Africa and Asia, funded renewable energy research, and promoted resilience in cities adapting to climate change. The Foundation's work in the 2010s often intersected with global policy discussions, giving the Rockefellers influence far beyond the size of their personal fortunes. Politically, J. Rockefeller remained a steady presence in the U.S. Senate until his retirement in 2015. Known for his commitment to healthcare reform and veterans affairs, he was widely respected as a thoughtful, pragmatic legislator. With his retirement, however, the Rockefeller name largely faded from electoral politics. Unlike Nelson, who had sought the presidency with relentless ambition, Jay represented a quieter form of service, dedicated, local, and understated. The cultural legacy of the family also endured. The Museum of Modern Art in New York expanded dramatically, cementing its role as one of the world's premier institutions for contemporary art. Rockefeller University continued to push the frontiers of biomedical research, producing Nobel Prize winners and groundbreaking discoveries. These institutions, founded decades earlier, remained vital in the 2010s, ensuring that the Rockefeller influence was felt not through individuals, but through enduring structures. Yet public perception was mixed. On the one hand, the family's commitment to sustainability and philanthropy earned admiration. On the other hand, critics argued that even their divestment from fossil fuels was symbolic rather than transformative. After all, their immense wealth had been created by oil, and no act of rebranding could erase that history. Conspiracy theories, too, continued to swirl in corners of the internet, portraying the Rockefellers as puppet masters behind global institutions, despite their actual decline in direct power. In many ways, this was the paradox of the 2010s for the Rockefellers. They were no longer among the richest families in America, far surpassed by tech billionaires, but they remained among the most influential. Their wealth was spread across generations, their public profile more muted, but their institutions and values still shaped conversations on health, environment, and culture. The rebrand worked in one crucial way: it kept them relevant. While other dynasties faded into obscurity, the Rockefellers managed to adapt their identity to the issues of the age. No longer the oil family, they became the philanthropy family, the sustainability family, the dynasty that had transformed itself from industrial empire builders into global problem solvers. By the end of the decade, the Rockefellers stood at a crossroads. Their legacy was secure, etched into universities, museums, foundations, and policies across the world. But the future was less certain. Could their descendants, raised in an era of transparency, activism, and rapid change, carry the name into another century of relevance? Or would the Rockefeller story, like so many dynasties before, gradually fade into history? One thing was clear: the family that had once controlled 90% of America's oil was now betting its future on sustainability, collaboration, and resilience. It was a transformation John D. Rockefeller Sr. himself might never have imagined, but perhaps would have admired for its methodical ambition. The 2020s began not with optimism, but with disruption. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe in early 2020, grinding economies to a halt, overwhelming health systems, and shaking societies to their core. For the Rockefeller Foundation, it was a defining test of relevance. Long before the virus spread, the foundation had warned of global pandemics. It had invested in health systems, surveillance technologies, and vaccine research. Now, those investments became urgently needed. Within weeks of the outbreak, the foundation mobilized hundreds of millions of dollars toward testing, vaccination efforts, and supporting frontline health workers. It partnered with governments and international organizations, providing funding and logistical support to ensure resources reached the most vulnerable populations. For many observers, this was the Rockefeller story repeating itself. Just as John D. Rockefeller Sr. had once funded the eradication of hookworm in the American South, and later yellow fever worldwide, his descendants' institutions were once again at the forefront of battling disease on a planetary scale. The Foundation's actions reminded the world that, while individual Rockefellers might no longer dominate headlines, their institutions remained deeply woven into humanity's struggle against crises. At the same time, the family's role in addressing climate change accelerated. Having divested from fossil fuels in the 2010s, the Rockefellers doubled down on renewable energy and environmental resilience in the 2020s. They funded solar and wind projects in developing nations, supported research into sustainable agriculture, and pushed major corporations to adopt net zero commitments. The irony was not lost on historians. The family whose fortune was built on oil was now investing heavily in a post-oil future. But the 2020s were not only about health and climate. The world had entered a period of fragmentation. Geopolitical rivalry, social polarization, and economic inequality were on the rise. The Rockefellers found themselves navigating a landscape where philanthropy itself was under scrutiny. Critics questioned whether wealthy families should wield so much influence over global priorities. Was it right that unelected elites could decide which diseases to fight, which crops to plant, or which nations to support? To their credit, the Rockefellers adapted. Their institutions increasingly embraced partnerships with local organizations, moving away from top-down models of philanthropy. They funded grassroots leaders in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, ensuring that global aid reflected local realities. This shift reflected a broader recognition. In a fragmented world, legitimacy comes not from wealth alone, but from collaboration. Meanwhile, younger Rockefellers took on new roles. Some embraced careers in philanthropy, others in environmental activism, others in business or academia. Unlike their ancestors, few sought political office or dominance in finance. Instead, they leaned into quieter forms of influence, building nonprofits, supporting social entrepreneurs, or working in international development. For them, carrying the Rockefeller name was not about commanding power but about stewarding a legacy. Yet, the name continued to carry weight. When the Rockefeller Foundation spoke, governments listened. When it released reports on climate, health, or food systems, they shaped debates in policy circles from Washington to Geneva. The family itself, dispersed across hundreds of descendants, had become less central than the institutions they left behind. The Rockefellers were no longer empire builders, they were system shapers. The pandemic also reminded the public of a lesson John D. Rockefeller Sr. had once articulated. Wealth, when hoarded, is sterile. When spread, it becomes powerful. As nations struggled with inequality exacerbated by COVID-19, the Rockefeller Foundation pledged billions to rebuild systems more equitably. Food insecurity, public health, and clean energy became its priorities. The aim was not just recovery but transformation, helping to ensure that the next global crisis would find the world better prepared. Still, the Rockefellers faced the challenge of perception. In a digital age defined by skepticism, conspiracy theories about the family proliferated online. Social media revived old accusations of shadowy control, secret agendas, and global domination. While largely unfounded, these narratives revealed how enduring the Rockefeller name remained in the public imagination, both as a symbol of power and as a target of suspicion. By the mid-2020s, the Rockefellers had endured yet another test of survival. They were no longer the richest, no longer the most feared, no longer even the most visible of America's dynasties. But their institutions remained indispensable. From pandemic response to climate action, from public health to social equity, the dynasty that began with a poor farm boy and his turkeys continued to shape the fate of millions. The 2020s proved one thing clearly: the Rockefeller story was not over. It had simply evolved again. The empire of oil had given way to a legacy of resilience, health, and sustainability. In a fragmented, uncertain world, the Rockefellers endured not by clinging to the past, but by reinventing themselves for the future. As the 2020s progress, the Rockefeller story enters an uncertain but fascinating chapter. The dynasty is more than 150 years old, spread across 6 generations, and no longer commands the towering wealth or fearsome monopoly it once did. Yet the Rockefeller name still resonates. It is written into the stone of universities, etched onto museum walls, woven into the fabric of medical research, and invoked in debates about wealth and power. The question now is not whether the Rockefellers matter, they clearly do, but how they will matter in the century ahead. One of the greatest challenges they face is relevance in a new age of wealth. The richest people in the world today are not old money dynasties, but entrepreneurs of the digital revolution. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page. Their fortunes dwarf that of any single Rockefeller descendant, and their influence in shaping technology, space exploration, and communication feels immediate and transformative. Against this backdrop, the Rockefellers can seem like living monuments to a bygone era. But the family has chosen a different path. Instead of competing with tech moguls in the race for headlines, they position themselves as stewards of long-term legacy. The Rockefellers emphasize sustainability, health, and global equity, issues that will define the next century as much as technology will. They remind the world that true power is not just about innovation in the present, but about institutions that endure for generations. Still, the dynasty faces another obstacle: criticism of philanthropy itself. In recent years, scholars, activists, and journalists have begun questioning whether billionaire philanthropy is truly altruistic, or simply another way for elites to exercise control. The Rockefeller Foundation, for all its achievements, is not immune to this scrutiny. Critics argue that unelected families should not decide the priorities of global health or climate policy. Supporters counter that without these institutions, many of the breakthroughs in medicine, agriculture, and education might never have happened. The family is aware of this tension. To adapt, the Rockefellers increasingly embrace collaborative philanthropy. Instead of dictating solutions from above, they fund grassroots organizations, partner with governments, and invite community leaders into decision-making processes. The idea is simple. Legitimacy in the 21st century comes not from money alone, but from shared responsibility. Internally, the dynasty also grapples with the challenge of continuity. With hundreds of descendants, the family is too large and too diverse to act as a single entity. Some Rockefellers remain deeply involved in philanthropy, while others live private lives far from the public eye. The wealth has been spread thinner over generations, and no single member dominates the way John D. Sr., Jr., or even David once did. Instead, the family's institutions, not the individuals, carry the torch forward. And yet, the family still produces public figures. J. Rockefeller's long Senate career, ending in 2015, demonstrated the family's continued role in politics. Other descendants lead environmental initiatives, cultural programs, or global development projects. Though none hold the singular power of their ancestors, collectively they keep the name alive in ways both visible and quiet. Another challenge is narrative. The Rockefeller story has always been contested. Were they robber barons or visionary builders? Ruthless monopolists or generous philanthropists? In the digital age, this debate continues, amplified by social media and conspiracy theories. The family remains both admired and mistrusted, both symbols of possibility and targets of suspicion. Managing this image, being transparent without diluting mystique, will define how they are remembered in the 21st century. Despite these challenges, the Rockefellers possess a unique advantage: institutions with deep roots. Rockefeller University remains a leader in medical science. The Museum of Modern Art is one of the world's great cultural landmarks. The Rockefeller Foundation continues to shape health, climate, and equity policy worldwide. These institutions do not depend on individual charisma. They endure, evolve, and adapt across decades. This is the ultimate continuity strategy. Where other fortunes vanish in 3 generations, the Rockefellers have built structures designed to last. John D. Sr.'s obsession with method, discipline, and long-term planning still defines the dynasty today. His motto, that money is only valuable when spread to help things grow, echoes in every program his descendants launch. Looking to the future, the Rockefellers are likely to remain less about wealth and more about influence. They may never again be the richest family in America. But as climate change, global inequality, and public health define the 21st century, the dynasty's pivot towards sustainability and resilience ensures they remain part of the solution. In that sense, the Rockefellers have achieved something extraordinary. They have transcended the narrow definition of dynasty as merely money and power. They have become an idea, a living experiment in whether wealth, properly stewarded, can outlive its founders and continue to serve the world. Their story then is not finished. It has simply entered another phase. The oil empire is gone, but the legacy endures. And in a world hungry for stability, that endurance may prove to be the most powerful legacy of all. From a struggling farm boy in Richford, New York, who raised turkeys to earn his first coins, to a dynasty spanning 6 generations and influencing the fate of nations, the Rockefeller story is one of the most remarkable in American history. It is a tale of contrasts and contradictions: ruthless monopoly and groundbreaking philanthropy, immense wealth and simple personal tastes, public mistrust and enduring institutions. At its heart lies John D. Rockefeller Sr., the man who built Standard Oil into the most powerful corporation of its time. To some, he was a robber baron who crushed competitors, manipulated markets, and bent governments to his will. To others, he was a visionary who brought order to a chaotic industry, made energy affordable for millions, and pioneered modern corporate structure. Both images contain truth, and both continue to define how he is remembered. What makes the Rockefeller story enduring, however, is not just the fortune amassed but what was done with it. By the end of his life, Rockefeller had given away more than $500 million, tens of billions in today's money. His foundations attacked diseases, advanced education, modernized agriculture, and built institutions that still shape the world today. He may have been ruthless in business, but in philanthropy he was methodical, disciplined, and visionary. His approach, strategic giving designed for maximum impact, set the model for modern philanthropy itself. His descendants carried that vision forward. John D. Rockefeller Jr. transformed the family into America's foremost philanthropic dynasty, giving rise to institutions like Rockefeller Center, the Museum of Modern Art, and Rockefeller University. The third generation, Nelson, David, Lawrence, John III, and Winthrop, expanded into politics, finance, conservation, and global development. Each left their own mark, reflecting both the opportunities and tensions of mid-20th century America. The later generations adapted to new realities. They confronted the legacy of oil by embracing environmentalism. They responded to global inequality with grassroots philanthropy. They entered politics, not with the presidential ambitions of Nelson, but with the steady service of J. Rockefeller. They moved from empire building to stewardship, from dominating industries to sustaining institutions. Through wars, depressions, scandals, and cultural revolutions, the Rockefellers endured because they mastered one principle: reinvention. They were never just a family of wealth. They were a family of systems, foundations, universities, cultural landmarks, that outlived any individual and kept the name relevant through changing times. And yet, their story is not without paradox. Could their philanthropy ever erase the ruthless tactics of Standard Oil? Can the family's embrace of sustainability truly absolve their role in fueling the fossil fuel age? These questions remain part of their legacy, a reminder that wealth, no matter how generously applied, always carries shadows. Perhaps the true meaning of the Rockefeller story lies in its scale and continuity. Unlike so many fortunes that vanished within a generation, the Rockefellers built a dynasty that spans centuries. Their institutions continue to fund research, preserve art, protect the environment, and fight global crises. Their name remains a byword for power, wealth, and philanthropy, even as new billionaires rise to eclipse them in raw fortune. The Rockefeller saga is, in many ways, the American story itself. Ambition and innovation, contradiction and reinvention, wealth and responsibility. It is a story of how money can corrupt, but also how it can heal. How empire can collapse, but legacy can endure. As the 21st century unfolds, the Rockefellers no longer dominate headlines. Their wealth has been diluted across generations, their influence spread through institutions rather than concentrated in individuals. But perhaps this is their greatest achievement. They built something larger than themselves, something that endures not because of one man's will, but because of a vision sustained across time. From oil barons to global stewards, the Rockefellers embody the paradox of power in the modern age. Their story is not one of perfection, but of persistence. Not one of purity, but of reinvention. And as long as their foundations fund research, their museums inspire culture, their universities train minds, and their name sparks debate, the Rockefeller story will continue, an unfinished chapter in the history of wealth, power, and human progress.